Story 1. The Passenger. The night weighed heavily on the lone stretch of highway, far from any signs of civilization. Bob Big Rig Mitchell, a seasoned trucker with a reputation for fearlessness, pushed his 18-wheeler forward through the obsidian void. His truck's engine roared, a familiar lullaby that usually accompanied him on these desolate roads. Bob had faced his share of eerie stories and supernatural legends throughout his years on the road. He scoffed at ghost stories and dismissed urban legends as truck stop chatter, but that night would change everything. As his truck rumbled down the empty road, Bob's keen eyes spotted something in the distance, just at the edge of his headlight's reach. At first he thought it was just a trick of the night, but the image became more defined as he drew nearer. A woman, standing alone on the road, her long dark hair obscuring her face. Bob's heart quickened, and he eased off the gas, slowing his rig as he approached the mysterious figure. His instincts screamed at him to keep driving, but a deep-rooted sense of responsibility for fellow travelers urged him to check if she needed help. He rolled down his window and called out, "Hey, are you all right?" The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, her hair concealing her features like a curtain of shadows. Bob's unease grew, but he couldn't bring himself to drive past her without at least making sure she was okay. He put his truck in park and climbed out, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Ma'am, do you need any assistance?" he asked again, his voice wavering. The woman slowly lifted her head, revealing piercing, somewhat luminescent eyes that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. Her face was pale and gaunt, her lips cracked and dry. She stared at Bob with an intensity that made his hair stand on end. "I need a ride," she whispered, her voice hollow and haunting. Bob hesitated for a moment, his rational mind screaming at him to get back in the truck and drive away. But against his better judgment, he opened the passenger door and motioned for her to climb in. The woman seemed to almost levitate into the cab, her cold presence sending a chill through the confined space. Bob's heart pounded as he slid back into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye, trying to make sense of the unsettling situation. "Where are you headed?" Bob finally asked, breaking the eerie silence that had settled in the cab. "Home," the woman replied, her voice barely audible above the hum of the engine. Bob's anxiety intensified. He knew there was no town or house for miles around, just the desolate road stretching into the unknown. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As they continued down the dark highway, the woman's presence seemed to cast a malevolent shadow over the truck. Bob's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He had changed his mind and wanted to send her out, to leave her on the side of the road, but fear kept him silent. Suddenly, the woman spoke again, her voice chillingly clear this time. "You shouldn't have stopped for me, Bob." Bob's heart stopped. How did she know his name? He stole a glance at her and her eyes met his, glowing with an unsettling knowingness. "Who are you?" Bob demanded, his voice trembling. She leaned closer, her face inches from his. "I'm the reason you'll never stop for another person ever again." Before Bob could react, her form began to change, shifting and warping until she was nothing but an amorphous, shadowy mass. Terror coursed through him as he realized he had picked up something inhuman, something that defied all reason. The truck swerved wildly, as Bob struggled to maintain control. He could hear her sinister laughter echoing in his mind as the world around him twisted and distorted. The truck seemed to take on a life of its own and careened off the road and into the darkness, its headlights fading into oblivion. The next morning, a passing trucker discovered the wreckage. The cab was empty, and there was no sign of Bob Mitchell. The police launched an investigation, and initially had little answers. 2 days later, Bob was found miles away from the wreckage, disoriented and disheveled. When the authorities located him, he was sitting by the side of the road, staring blankly into the distance. When he finally came to his senses, Bob recounted the story of the woman, her haunting presence, and the malevolent force that had seemed to possess his truck. But when asked about the 2 days following the crash, his memory was an impenetrable void. He couldn't recall how he had ended up miles away from the wreckage, or what had transpired during that time. In the years that followed, Bob's story became a legend among truckers and travelers. The highway, a lifeline for those who traversed it, now took on an air of mystery and uncertainty. Bob himself grappled with the events of that night. No one could provide answers to the lingering questions. Why had he been found so far from the wreckage, and what had transpired during the days that had slipped through his consciousness like grains of sand through an hourglass? The answers, it seems, will forever lie with the passenger, in the unknown. Story 2. There's something in here with me. The following is a tale that I experienced as a young man. It was a weekend like any other, or so I thought. My parents were headed out of town for a short trip, leaving me alone at home. I was a 14-year-old boy, and the idea of having the whole house to myself for a couple of days was incredibly exciting. My parents left on Friday morning, promising to be back by Sunday evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that first night alone, I settled into my bed with a feeling of independence and freedom. I immersed myself in a movie marathon, indulging in junk food and reveling in the sense of being in charge. Around midnight, my eyelids grew heavy, and I finally succumbed to sleep. A chill in the air awoke me. I blinked, disoriented, as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting a ghostly glow across my room. I could hear the wind rustling the leaves outside, and for a moment I just lay there, wrapped in a cozy blanket of silence. But then, something caught my attention. A faint rustling sound, like footsteps on carpet, reached my ears. My heart began to race as I realized I wasn't alone. Fear clawed at my chest, paralyzing me. I strained my eyes in the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A shape, indistinct yet undeniably present, standing near the foot of my bed. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I stared at the creature. Its form was like something out of a nightmare, a contortion of something grotesque and hideous. Its eyes gleamed with an eerie, unnatural light. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation, but there was none that fit. This was no ordinary intruder. I summoned my courage and tried to speak, but my voice came out as a barely audible squeak. The creature didn't move, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me, penetrating into the depths of my soul. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to escape, but I was rooted to the bed, held captive by an inexplicable force. Then, the creature moved. It began to slink closer, its movements sinuous and otherworldly. Panic surged through me, a wild animal trapped in a corner. I reached for my phone, fingers fumbling in my haste. With trembling hands, I turned on the flashlight app, casting a beam of light into the darkness. The creature recoiled, as if the light itself was a weapon against it. The unearthly glow in its eyes wavered, and I could see it more clearly now. A twisted, nightmarish amalgamation of limbs and flesh. Its presence radiated malevolence, a force beyond my comprehension. I took a deep breath and mustered every ounce of courage I had left. With the flashlight fixed on the creature, I slowly edged towards the bedroom door. It seemed to grow more agitated, its movements jittery and unpredictable. As I reached the door, I bolted out of the room, my heart pounding like a drum. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. The moon hung above, casting an ethereal glow on the landscape. The adrenaline rush began to ebb, and a cold realization settled in. My home, my sanctuary, had been invaded by something inexplicable, something that defied the laws of reality. Feeling utterly helpless and not knowing what else to do, I fled to a friend's house, desperation urging my pounding fists against his door. The sudden noise startled everyone in the house, but their concern quickly turned to sympathy as they recognized my distress. Without hesitation, they welcomed me in, providing a haven where I could stay until my parents returned home. The remainder of the weekend was a blur. I stayed with the friend, too terrified to return home until my parents did. When they finally arrived on Sunday evening, I recounted the horrifying experience to them. They exchanged worried glances, but offered little in the way of explanation. Years have gone by now, and the memory of that night still sends my heart into a pounding frenzy. I can never fully explain what I saw that night, but one thing that I believe for certain is that the darkness holds secrets, and sometimes, when you're alone and vulnerable, those secrets can come to visit, leaving you to grapple with the chilling reality that you are never truly alone in the dark. Story 3. There's something wrong with my sister. I can still remember it as if it happened yesterday, even though it's been decades. Halloween night in our small, quiet neighborhood was always a special occasion. The anticipation of dressing up and collecting candy was enough to make any kid's heart race with excitement. My story happened back in the late 90s. I was just a young boy back then, and my older sister had promised to take me trick-or-treating. Little did I know that this Halloween would terrify me for years to come. We headed out just as the sun was about to set, and I remember there being an electricity in the air. I guess part of it was excitement, and part of it was fear, because I was still a little boy, and could still get scared quite easily. My sister dressed as a witch, and had the entire outfit head to toe. She even had a witch's mask, with the pointy nose and everything. She held my hand tightly as we knocked on doors and yelled, "Trick or treat." We went door to door, and I scooped up as much candy as I could get my hands on. About 45 minutes in, we got separated for a brief moment. When I finally caught up to her, I asked her where she had been, but she just looked at me. I didn't think much of it, and grabbed her hand, and we continued going door to door for about 15 or 20 more minutes. As we continued trick-or-treating, something felt off about her. She wasn't speaking much, and her movements were just weird. Honestly, I thought maybe she saw somebody she didn't like, or saw a boy she did like with someone else or something. I honestly didn't know. When we returned home, she was still acting weird. My parents were in the garage handing out candy, so I ran up to them and showed them how much I had gathered. My sister just kind of stood around and didn't talk. My sister had always been full of energy, but something was up and she was eerily quiet. Her and I went inside and left my parents to finish up handing out candy. My sister moved slowly into the kitchen. I remember her taking really slow steps and just looking around. It was so creepy. I went into the living room to tend to my candy. I was snacking away, just eating candy, when I asked my sister if she was ever going to take off her costume. At least take that hideous mask off. When I didn't get a response, I turned around and she was standing directly behind me, just staring at me, motionless. At this point, I was part creeped out and part annoyed. Part of me told me that she was really going the extra mile to creep me out, and the other part told me that something was really off. Just then, I could hear some loud talking coming from the garage where my parents were. I turned back around, and a few seconds later they bolted through the door. Looking part terrified and part panicked, they looked at me and asked who was with me. I was confused, and gave them that kind of look like, "What are you talking about?" Just then, my sister, with her mask off, walked in behind them. My eyes got really wide and I was so confused. I turned around and whoever was behind me that I thought was my sister was gone. In the kitchen, the door that led to the backyard was wide open. My parents were in a panic and started searching all around the house. Whoever it was never found. What's even creepier is that we later found that a knife was missing from the knife block, and we were never able to find it. To this day, I tell myself that it really was just my sister, and she had just snuck out the back door and came around to the garage. But she swears it wasn't. She said that she lost me and couldn't find me, and so she just came home, and that's where she found me. There are still so many questions, though. If it wasn't my sister, who the hell was it and what were their intentions? If it wasn't her, how was it then that whoever it was could have had the same exact costume that my sister was wearing? Where in the hell did that knife go? As a grown man now, it's a mystery that still gives me chills to think about all these years later.
Story 4. We were stalked. The story I am about to tell happened to my friend Emily and me last summer in the Sam Houston National Forest in East Texas. Emily and I decided to go on a camping trip. We've been best friends since childhood, and our shared love for adventure and the great outdoors had brought us there. The reason for our camping trip was pretty simple. We needed a break from the hustle and bustle of city life. We both love the outdoors, the woods, wildlife, and a sense of peace that you just can't get in the city. We wanted to enjoy the outdoors, unplug from our devices, and reconnect with nature. After a day of hiking and fun, we set up camp in a beautiful clearing, surrounded by huge trees. The sun got low, so we started a small campfire and shared stories. We were laughing and reminiscing about our childhood. The night was calm and amazing at first. We were having such a good time. But very quickly, things went south. A little after midnight, Emily and I decided to call it a night. We threw some water on the fire and headed to our tents, each one only a few feet apart from the other. Inside my tent, I wished Emily a good night and closed my eyes. I don't know how much time went by, but shortly after I dozed off, I woke up when I started hearing noises from the wood line. At first, it was like a grunting noise. I told myself to chill and that it was probably a deer or something. Maybe it was a deer snort rather than a grunt. Well, that instantly changed when the grunts turned to growls. Low, guttural growls. Whatever it was sounded absolutely massive. There was something else too that I noticed that I hadn't before when I first started hearing the grunts. It was completely silent. There was nothing. No crickets, no frogs, no bugs. Absolutely nothing. By this time, I'm pretty terrified now, and I start calling for Emily. She was wide awake too. I asked her if she was hearing the same thing that I was, and she said that she was. Neither of us knew what the hell to do. We were miles from anything and had nowhere to go. I told her I was coming over, and so I grabbed my phone and things and hurried over to her tent. Once I got over there, we went back and forth about what to do. We were out in the middle of nowhere and had absolutely no cell phone reception. The growls kept coming and they were getting louder. We started hearing branches breaking too. There was something out there. It sounded really large, and it seemed like it was pissed. We finally decided that we should get a fire going again. We just didn't know what else to do. Luckily, we still had a bunch of wood, and so we hopped out of the tent and got to work. I got a flashlight and started pointing it at the woods, but didn't see anything. Emily was working on the fire, and at first it was hard to get one going because we had dumped water on the previous one. But after some work, we finally got it going. I set my light down to grab more wood, and all of a sudden I looked over at Emily, and she was looking out at the wood line, and she was shaking, almost violently. I called out to her, but she was absolutely petrified. I kept asking her what it was and what was going on, but she couldn't say anything. Finally, she kind of motioned her head towards the woods and said, "There's something staring at us." I looked over at the wood line, and at first I didn't see anything, but then I saw it. It was a massive silhouette of something, and it looked like it was creeping behind a tree. When I say massive, I don't mean large. I mean it was absolutely massive. All I could make out was a shoulder, arm, and half of a head at first. It looked like it was hairy all over. And then it stepped out from the tree that it was behind. It was upright, completely covered in hair and on two legs. Its arms were unnaturally long and it looked like it had hands. It's hard to tell, but if I had to guess the height of what I was looking at, I would say that it had to have been between 8 and 9 feet tall. It's hard to describe in words just how big this thing was. What I'm about to say next is where I lose most people in the very few times that I've told this story. When it came out from behind the tree and looked at us, its eyes were glowing red. I swear on everything, they were glowing. It wasn't eye shine. They were glowing, and they were red. And I say it was a thing because it was not a man. The way it moved was so fluid that it couldn't be a man in a suit, and it was way too large. It went behind another tree, and for a moment it was completely silent. Nothing. And then we heard a blood-curdling scream. It was so loud and so powerful that both of us believed that we were going to die. Both of us gripped each other and started crying, almost uncontrollably, just shaking and crying and not knowing what to do. The thing was growling and moving around, and we could hear branches breaking all over. We stood there absolutely frozen. Then at some point during all of this, I snapped out of it. I came to the realization that we were out in the middle of nowhere and had nowhere to go. I looked at Emily and shook her a little bit to try to snap her out of it too. She looked at me and I said, "Listen, We need to get this fire going as much as possible. We need to make it big." She nodded, and I told her to start throwing more wood on it. So she started doing that, and I grabbed the flashlight again. I pointed it towards the wood line, but whatever it wasn't there anymore. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't where it was standing before. I don't know, but something told me that maybe the light will keep it away. And so that's what I did. I turned the flashlight on high beam and pointed it at the wood line. I started scanning the wood line back and forth, back and forth. I was terrified. If it wasn't where we had seen it earlier, where was it? Did it go back into the woods? Was it sneaking up on us? I didn't know, and that absolutely terrified me. I scanned all around the perimeter of our campsite and didn't see anything, so I at least felt like it wasn't sneaking up on us. Seconds felt like minutes, minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like days. All I could think to do was just keep fire and light going and wait it out, and then get the hell out of there as soon as there was daylight. And so that's what we did. For probably 3 hours we kept wood on the fire, and I kept constantly scanning the woods with my flashlight. During this time we continued to hear growls, rustling, and branches breaking. It seemed like the fire and the light were working, though. There were 2 other times that I saw glowing, or what I believed to be its eyes, in the woods. Both times it was at a distance, and both times they ducked out as soon as my flashlight hit them. Eventually, as the sun started coming up, the noises started retreating. There were fewer and fewer growls and fewer branch breaks. The sun finally topped out over the horizon, and we didn't hear anything else. When we were confident that whatever it was gone, we grabbed our phones and backpacks and headed out. We left the tents, fire, and everything else behind. We were probably about 4 miles out from the car, and so we made our way back as quickly as possible, scanning the woods as we went. When we finally got back to the car, we hopped in and drove away as fast as we could. We never returned for our tents and haven't been back since. After telling this story to a few close family and friends, it was clear that they thought we were crazy. They asked if we were drinking. They asked if we were doing drugs. And the answer to all of these questions has always been no. And so eventually we quit telling this story to everyone. To this day, I don't know what it was that we saw that night, but I do know for certain that there is something absolutely terrifying out there, and Emily and I will never venture out into those woods ever again at night. That's my story. It happened, and nobody will ever convince me that I didn't see what I saw or experience what I experienced. Story 5. Emma's Friend. Moving to an old farmhouse in Lockwood, Missouri was supposed to be a fresh start for our family of 4. After my husband lost his job, the sudden inheritance of the property from his great-aunt seemed like a serendipitous gift. The land sprawled over a couple of acres, with the house looking like something out of an old-time movie, complete with a rickety fence and a swing set in the backyard. The moment we moved in, little Emma, our 3-year-old, was drawn to that swing set like a moth to a flame. I remember her excited shouts, "Mom, look, a swing!" We laughed, letting her tire herself out as she merrily pushed her imaginary friend on the swing. It was harmless, we thought. Within days, she started referring to her imaginary friend as the little girl. At breakfast, she'd narrate tales of how the little girl used to live in our house and would play on the swing every day. Honestly, we were more impressed by her creativity than concerned. Kids do have vivid imaginations after all. But then, strange things started happening. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and found all the chairs overturned. When I asked Emma, she shrugged and whispered, "The little girl did it. She's unhappy." I assumed Emma was testing boundaries, a phase perhaps. However, our stay in Lockwood quickly devolved from peaceful to eerie. Lights would suddenly flicker. Doors would slam unexpectedly. On one unsettling evening, as I made my way to the basement to fetch some old toys, The door slammed behind me. I wrestled with the knob, but found myself trapped. It felt like forever down there until my husband heard my panicked shouts and rescued me. Emma, looking up from her drawings, simply remarked, "She doesn't want you here." As days passed, my earlier amusement with Emma's tales turned to dread. My eldest son, Mike, also grew wary. He confessed to hearing footsteps outside his room at night. Yet, it was an incident with my husband that convinced us something was very wrong. It was a crisp morning, and I watched from the kitchen as he walked upstairs. Minutes later, I heard a horrified scream and a thud. Turning around, I found him sprawled at the foot of the staircase, clutching his leg. He looked at me, terror in his eyes. "Someone pushed me, I swear." It was then that our attempts to rationalize everything ceased. We decided to dig deeper into the history of the house. The town's local librarian helped us find old newspaper clippings about the property. A chilling revelation awaited us. 70 years ago, a young girl had tragically passed away in a house fire right where our home stood. She loved playing on the swing set. We couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Even Emma became withdrawn, repeatedly saying, "The little girl is unhappy that we're living in her house." But nothing could have prepared us for one fateful night. Awoken by a strong smell of smoke, we found the house engulfed in flames. Panic set in. Racing to Emma's room, we found her calmly sitting on her bed. "I warned you," she whispered. "The little girl said it's too late." Desperately, we tried to exit, but none of the doors would budge. It's like they were all locked from the outside, trapping us in. The heat intensified, and our hope dwindled. But in that dire moment, adrenaline kicked in. My husband, in a Herculean effort, shattered a living room window with a chair, creating an escape route. The cold night air was a stark contrast to the scalding heat inside. We watched our supposed fresh start turn to ashes. The haunting silhouette of the swing set was the only thing left unscathed in the backyard. As dawn broke, we decided unanimously we wouldn't return. Whatever memories the house held, they weren't ours to keep. We were just grateful to have made it out alive. Today, all that remains of our short stay in Lockwood is scarred memories and Emma's innocent words. "She doesn't want you here." If only we had listened sooner.
Story 6. I live to tell about the Jersey Devil. The story I'm sharing with you happened to me a few years ago in the New Jersey Pinelands. Hunting season had just opened up, and I couldn't have been more excited about it. I've been a hunter all my life, and I was eager to get out and do the thing I loved. I headed out early so I could get to my spot before the sun started coming up. I had been in this spot before and felt that it had good potential. I found a nice tree, settled up against it, and as normal hunts go, I waited. A few hours passed as I watched and listened to the forest around me. The woods were alive with the sounds of birds and squirrels, and everything seemed normal. As the day wore on, I began to grow restless. I'd been in this spot for quite a while and hadn't seen or heard anything yet. I was just about ready to call it a day when I began to hear some motion behind me. It sounded like it was moving up towards me, so rather than turning around, I waited to see if it would come up and around into my field of view. Whatever it was sounded like it was on 4 legs. After all these years, the thrill of the hunt still excited me. I figured it was what I had come for, so I waited, my heart beginning to pound with anticipation. The steps were getting closer, and they seemed to be moving up from behind me and to my left. When I felt like it was close enough, and within my field of view, I slowly turned my head and strained to see through some underbrush and deadfall. At first, I could see some movement but couldn't make out any fine details. It was black in color, but that's about all that I could see. I wasn't sure yet what it was, but it definitely wasn't a deer. Maybe a black bear? Confusion started to settle in. Whatever it was down low. Then, it started making some noises. Sounds that I would describe as unnatural. They weren't loud, but they weren't like anything I've heard before. At least not in the woods. The best I could describe them as is the sounds that a baby would make. Kind of like a cackle and a grunt mixed together. Again, very difficult to describe, and very creepy. Then it rose up. Honestly, my first thought was to think to myself, wait, is that a horse? It was definitely black, and looked like it had a horse's head. So many thoughts went through my head in a fraction of a second. Is it a horse? What is a horse doing out here? Is that thing up on 2 legs? What in the hell am I looking at? The details of this thing began rushing in. It was still covered by some deadfall and brush, but I could now see from its lower chest up. The way it was positioned, it had to be standing on 2 legs. It was absolutely hideous. It looked like it had horns and it was sniffing at the air. It looked like it didn't have any hair, and its eyes were just as dark as its skin. I was absolutely frozen and terrified. I didn't know what I was looking at, but it hadn't yet seen me, and I was praying that it wouldn't. Luckily, I was downwind, and it was looking away from me. After a few sniffs, it dropped back down. It seemed to meander behind the brush for what felt like an eternity, and then it seemed to turn and walk back the way it came in. When I believed that it was turning back, I swear I saw a tail flick in the air. I don't know what else it could have been. I sat there, motionless, listening as it walked back deeper into the forest. After not hearing anything for a few moments, I gathered my things and hurried my way out of there as quickly as possible. When I got home, I told my wife. "Sounds like you saw the Jersey Devil," she said with a skeptical look. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I never saw wings, or the full body, or anything like that. But of the parts that I did see, it definitely matches up with other accounts of what others would call the Jersey Devil. I don't go into the woods as much as I used to, and if I were being honest with myself, I would say that the encounter has a lot to do with that. I don't know for certain what I saw that day, but I do know with certainty that there is something out there that shouldn't exist. Story 7. The House That Hid Secrets. The tale I'm about to share is not for the faint of heart. It's a nightmare that still haunts my dreams, one that unfolded within the walls of our very own beautiful home. My wife and I were newlyweds, excited with the prospect of moving into a historical home. It was a magnificent 1920s architectural masterpiece that exuded a peculiar charm. It was a sanctuary for our dreams, a place to hold us as we grew together, or so we thought. What we would soon discover, however, was that there was something in our home more terrifying than any ghost story I could have ever imagined. In the beginning, our new home was everything that we could have possibly hoped for, a home built from the era of the Roaring '20s. We were so in love with it, so much so that we became blissfully ignorant of the malevolence lurking in its corners. As the days and weeks went by, an uneasy tension seemed to build and emanate from the house itself. It seemed to watch and wait, savoring our vulnerability. Each night we heard faint, muffled whispers that we could never quite decipher. We blamed it on the old house's quirks and tried to ignore the growing unease that began to gnaw at us. An unease that reached a turning point on a frigid, moonless night. I was home alone, my wife away visiting family. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. An eerie, inexplicable force had taken hold of me, calling me towards the attic, inviting me to examine its hidden mysteries and secrets, an invitation that I would accept, hoping to dispel my irrational fears. Until this point, the excitement of our new marriage and the bliss of our new home had occupied our attention, causing us to neglect the attic, which now beckoned with an unsettling urgency. Ascending the creaky stairs, I couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere that pressed down on me. Dust motes swirled in the dim light as I opened the attic door. The air grew cold, as if the house itself knew of the sinister secret lurking within. The attic was a desolate wasteland of forgotten belongings, a time capsule from decades past. It was as if the attic had been frozen in time, its contents untouched by the passage of years. Old trunks and suitcases draped in cobwebs lined the perimeter of the dimly lit space, their leather and canvas exteriors weathered by years of neglect. The air was thick with the musty scent of aged paper and memories long gone. Antique furniture, draped in dusty sheets, stood sentinel in the attic's corners, while forgotten family heirlooms gathered dust on wooden shelves. Faded photographs, some yellowed with age, stared back at me from cracked frames, their subjects forever captured in moments of the past. Having felt that I had thoroughly investigated the attic and its hidden mysteries, I turned to retreat back down to the lower levels. As I began to turn, something came over me, compelling me to investigate the farthest corner of the attic. As I inched closer, I noticed a heavy, moth-eaten curtain. With trembling hands, I pulled it aside, revealing a secret room. What I found inside was a chamber of horrors. The room was adorned with macabre symbols and covered in sinister writings. A tattered mattress was stained with something that looked eerily like blood. My heart pounded in my chest as a dark realization washed over me. This room was a shrine to darkness, a place where unspeakable rituals had taken place. Fear clawed at me as I fled from the attic and contacted the authorities. Armed with flashlights that cut through the inky darkness, the officers approached the tattered curtain, pushing it aside to unveil the oppressive room, just as I had done before. What they found, and what I had failed to find, was a hidden door, a portal to the rooftop and the outside world. Just a short distance away, a tree, providing the necessary means to ascend and descend from the secret doorway. The discovery bore down on me like a ton of bricks. It seemed that an intruder had been using this secret passage to gain access to our home, creeping in and out like a phantom under the cover of darkness, performing disturbing rituals just above our unsuspecting heads. My thoughts were a whirlwind of disbelief and confusion. How could we have missed this? How could we have never seen the door from the outside? How could we have never inspected the attic before moving in? I tried to comfort myself, telling myself that this would have slipped by anyone. The doorway was camouflaged too well on the outside. Anyone would have missed it, right? The most unsettling revelation, however, had yet to come to light. On the floor of the concealed room, amidst discarded food wrappers, rested a diary. It belonged to the attic dweller. Within its pages lay not only an obsession with my wife and me, but also a malevolent intent to seize our lives for the sake of sinister rituals. The diary was brimming with ominous incantations and chilling drawings of my wife and me, rendered in nightmarish and distorted forms. A meticulous and urgent investigation of the house ensued. We relentlessly searched for any trace of the elusive attic dweller. Despite our efforts, the unwelcomed guest was never found that night, or any other night after. He had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind an unsettling sense of uncertainty that would haunt us for years to come. As I share this harrowing experience with you, I can still feel the oppressive weight of that house on my shoulders. The evil that resided within those walls was real, a force that had been watching, waiting, and plotting. The memory of that house serves as a dark reminder that even the most beautiful homes can harbor the darkest of nightmares. At times, the most frightening stories aren't confined to books or movies, but are rather concealed within the very walls of our own homes.
Story 8. The Dying Light of the Park. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the lively park as I brought the children to play. The park was teeming with life, children laughing, dogs frolicking, and parents chatting. But as the latecomers, I found the children and I parked further from the park's bustling center than I would have liked. The children's excitement was palpable as we joined the throng of people enjoying the vibrant setting. We spent hours playing, laughing, and making memories, the world around us alive with the joy of shared experiences. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, a subtle shift occurred. Families began to gather their belongings and depart, leaving us alone amidst the fading light. Suddenly, the park that had felt so welcoming began to feel eerie and desolate. The laughter of children faded into the distance, replaced by the unsettling rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. I could sense a growing unease, a feeling that we were intruders in a place that had transformed into something far more sinister as the day waned. As the children's play grew quieter, my eyes were drawn to the edge of the park, where the trees loomed like sentinels against the dying light. There, amidst the shadows, stood a mysterious figure, its form barely discernible. It seemed to watch us with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine, its gaze unrelenting as the darkness deepened. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach, and I urged the children to gather their things so we could leave. But the path back to the car was elusive, and what had once been a vibrant park now felt like a labyrinth of uncertainty. Panic began to set in as the woods seemed to close in around us, the ominous figure still lingering at the edge of our vision. The children's laughter had turned to terrified screams as we stumbled through the darkness, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The figure seemed to shadow our every move, its eyes glowing like malevolent beacons in the night. The woods seemed to whisper with secrets that only intensified our fear. Desperation fueled our steps as we retraced our path, the darkness making it impossible to discern landmarks. The figure's presence crept closer, its sinister aura a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the trees. With every breath, every heartbeat, the feeling of impending doom grew stronger. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, a break in the trees revealed the faint glimmer of headlights in the distance. We raced toward the car, our breathless gasps punctuating the silence of the night. As the children scrambled into the vehicle, I leaped into the driver's seat and glanced out the window one last time. There, just a few feet away, stood the figure, its devious eyes locked onto mine. It laughed, a chilling sound that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Its heavy breaths hung in the air, a sinister reminder of the danger we had narrowly escaped. With trembling hands, I started the car and sped away, the park's desolate emptiness fading into the distance. The weight of the encounter would forever haunt us, a reminder that even in the most familiar of places, darkness and danger could lurk just beyond the light's reach.
Story 9. A horrific camping story. Solitude, they say, offers serenity. For my wife and me, the heart's truest peace was found away from the hum and hustle of city life. Our isolated adventures, as we lovingly called them, were our sanctuaries. A way to unplug from social life, society, and obligations, and plug into nature, the earth, and its beautiful scenery. That would all change the one fateful weekend, on an isolate strip of beach in Northern California. Our decision to venture to this reclusive spot was influenced by whispers of its untouched beauty. Nestled away from the well-trodden tourist trails, it was said to be a place where you could hear the earth breathe. Accessible only through a narrow, winding path covered by overarching trees, it seemed the perfect locale for our next escapade. On our arrival, the place did more than live up to its reputation. The vast expanse of golden sands, untouched by footprints, stretched out invitingly before us. Distant cliffs stood tall, silently watching over the beach, their faces eroded by time and weather. The hypnotic sound of waves kissing the shoreline felt like nature's own lullaby. With great enthusiasm, we set up our little campsite near a cluster of rocks, providing us with a vantage point of the vast ocean. We gathered driftwood, kindling a fire whose flames danced merrily against the darkening canvas of the sky. As night descended, the universe unveiled its majesty. A blanket of stars glittered above, their twinkle reflected in the shimmering waters below. Hand in hand, we lay on the sand, allowing the tranquility to envelop us. This was the stuff that dreams were made of. Life just couldn't get any better. Having soaked up every ounce of beauty and nature that we could that day, we extinguished our fire, retired to the tent, and settled in to sleep. All was well, until it happened. In the dead of the night, we were awakened by a piercing, blood-curdling scream that ripped through our tent. Both my wife and I shot straight up, like we were yanked from the ground by a cord. "What was that?" my wife said as she grabbed my arm, gripping me with the force of a steel clamp. "I don't know," I whispered. For a moment, an eerie silence prevailed. The once hypnotic sound of the waves, which had resembled a lullaby, had now taken a turn and seemed to usher in something ominous. The ensuing moments stretched on endlessly. We strained our ears, desperate to catch any other sounds. Our eyes were wide open, every muscle frozen, hoping to remain unseen even within the cover of our tent. Gathering some courage, I cautiously leaned forward and unzipped the tent's entrance just a crack, allowing myself a narrow vantage point to survey the outside. As I did, my wife's hand moved slowly towards a flashlight, but just as she was about to switch it on, I grabbed it. "Wait," I whispered. "I see something." In the distance, a faint glow hovered just above the water's surface, slightly to the east. I squinted, trying to discern its nature. What was it? Was it an orb? Perhaps some odd reflection? My speculations were abruptly interrupted as a second light blazed into life. It was unmistakably a flashlight, a powerful one, emanating from a boat. Its beam crawled back and forth slowly, against the very shoreline that we were occupying. The light inched towards us, steadily narrowing the distance. It was a beam with malicious intent, like a snake slithering across the shoreline, looking for prey. "What the hell?" I whispered, unintentionally sending my wife into a panic. "What is it? What's happening?" she asked. Her words fell on deaf ears, my entire focus riveted on the rapidly encroaching beam. My heart began to pound faster and faster. It was just feet away now, inching closer and closer, threatening to reveal our presence on this supposedly deserted stretch of beach. I squinted, expecting to be blinded by the onslaught of light emanating from this boat. But then, just as we were about to be exposed, it abruptly went dark. A voice floated from the distance, barely discernible. "We're clear," the voice said. For a fleeting moment, everything went still again. My breath caught in my throat, and my teeth clenched as I cautiously unzipped the tent further to get a better look. Beside me, my wife craned her neck, her eyes stretched wide and unblinking, attempting to get a look herself. Those few seconds felt endless. Our attention locked onto the boat, hoping to gather additional details to try to better decipher what was going on. Then, jarring the stillness, a motor roared to life. The sound was coming from the boat, but it wasn't the boat's motor, it was something else. It sounded smaller, but powerful nonetheless. The motor's noise oscillated, screaming loudly as if it was being throttled, then idling only to scream again and then idle back down. It did this, repeatedly, dozens of times. "Hurry up!" A voice, deep and menacing, could be heard between the intervals in the motor's screams. And then, as abruptly as it had started, the motor went silent. Questions swirled in my mind. What were they up to? Why were they operating under such secrecy in the middle of the ocean, shielded by the cover of night? And then, plopping sounds, as if sizable chunks of something were being dumped into the water. My wife and I looked at each other, desperately searching for answers. Every moment brought more and more confusion. Suddenly, a dark voice queried, its tone echoing over the water. "Are we good?" Another voice responded, "Yeah." "Good," the first voice replied. "Then let's get the hell out of here." Our eyes strained as we caught glimpses of hurried, deliberate movement. Then, the motor once again roared to life. This time, it was the sound of the boat's engine. We watched as the silhouette of the boat began to move, heading off to the east. It grew smaller and smaller, as did the sound of its engine, until they were both finally gone. My wife and I just looked at each other. "What just happened?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, "but whatever it is, and whoever they were, they're gone now." She nodded in agreement, but still had a slight look of concern on her face. "Try to get some sleep," I said to her. "We'll get up and out of here at first light." She agreed and settled back in. I zipped the door back up, settled back in, and closed my eyes as my wife cuddled up against me. I listened to the sound of the ocean, a sweet lullaby once again, and slowly dozed back off to sleep. All was well. The dark presence that lurked in the ocean was gone, and the tranquility of nature once again enveloped us. That is, until I heard another blood-curdling scream. This time, when I darted up, it was daylight outside. I looked over, and my wife was gone. I yelled for her, only to hear another piercing scream. I threw off my blanket and unzipped the tent. As I took my first step out onto the sandy beach, I was met with yet another scream. This time I could tell where it was coming from. It was my wife. She had gotten up before I did and started a fire to boil some water for coffee. As she was waiting for the fire to grow, she looked over and saw something wash up on shore. It was a foot, a human foot, and it wasn't attached to a body. She was hysterical, as she had every right to be. I was overcome with terror myself, but tried to hold it together for the both of us. I tried to comfort her. It's okay, I said. You're okay. I quickly ushered her over to the tent. Just stay in here, I said. I'm calling the police now. She nodded her head up and down as she struggled to breathe, her eyes pouring tears now. I looked down at my phone. I could barely dial 911 because my hands were shaking so badly. Within minutes, the first wave of police officers arrived, then the patrol boats, and finally the helicopters, both law enforcement and media. There was a chaotic whirlwind of activity. Over the coming hours, more body parts would wash up. First an arm, then a leg, and then another foot. 2 days later, a dive team would eventually recover the head. The roar of the little motor that we had heard the night before, it became evident, was that of a chainsaw, making small work of its victim to be thrown to the ocean. The coming months were a nightmare for my wife and me. We were questioned by the police multiple times. Like a press bearing down on us, they did everything that they could to extract every detail of information that we had to offer. It was difficult, but we understood that it was necessary. Eventually it paid off and arrests were made. A bad business deal, it seems, was the motive. So sad. Outings for my wife and me were never the same. Our isolated adventures had lost their magic. Having given way to the ominous memories of our beach getaway, they became fewer and farther between. Questions from that night still linger in my mind. What if that beam of light had made its way over just a few more feet? We would have been discovered, and then what? Would we have been victims too? Or would our presence have stopped the events of that night from unfolding altogether? That isolated stretch of beach may hold those answers forever. As for my wife and I, we're doing our best to forge new memories. We're doing our best to let the waves of the past recede, while focusing on the horizons of our future.
Story 10. Horror in the Sorority House. Halloween, the holiday I cherished above all others, had always held a special place in my heart. My childhood was marked by delightful memories of trick-or-treating, but now, as a grown-up faced with adult decisions, my Halloween traditions had evolved. A few years ago, I was a college student in a sorority, anticipating the grandest party of the year. My sisters and I were all eagerly awaiting the arrival of the spookiest holiday, eager to celebrate it in style. Little did I realize that this Halloween would forever destroy my feelings toward this once-beloved holiday. The day had been a whirlwind of excitement. We spent hours getting dressed in our elaborate costumes, carefully applying makeup and doing our hair. Laughter filled the air as we helped each other perfect our looks. But as the clock ticked away, a dreadful realization had come over me. I had yet to finish a critical paper for my criminal law class that was due the next morning. I was crushed. In the hustle and bustle of the day, I had completely forgotten about it. Dutifully, I decided to stay behind while my sisters went to the party. I was all alone in our sorority house, and the ambiance was eerie. The old Victorian building creaked with every gust of wind, and the dimly lit hallways seemed to stretch on forever. I settled into our common room, surrounded by the silence that was only interrupted by the occasional distant laughter from the partygoers traversing the street outside. I sighed, preparing to focus on my paper and make the most of the solitude. Hours passed, and the only company I had was the eerie silence that had enveloped the house. The clock on the wall seemed to move slower than usual, as if time itself had conspired against me. There was a thick, ominous aura in the air. It was a dreadful feeling, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. As I was engrossed in my work, I heard what I believed to be a muffled scream and a thud. My heart raced as I was sure that I was the only one in the house. I chalked it up to my imagination running wild, trying to scare me on Halloween night. Then, I began to hear creaks in the floorboards, and they seemed to be coming from the hallway just outside the common room. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, My instincts told me that something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to investigate. Suddenly, the door to the common room slowly swung open, and what I witnessed next will forever be burned into my memory. In the doorway loomed a dark figure, cloaked in shadows, his eyes glowing with sinister intentions. My heart raced as his piercing gaze locked onto me, freezing me in place. The silence was deafening, only to finally be broken by 3 words that slithered out of the stranger's mouth. "Trick or treat," the figure said. I began shaking uncontrollably. Just as the terror of this figure threatened to engulf me entirely, salvation arrived in an unexpected form. My sorority sisters returned from their night of revelry, their voices echoing through the house. The figure in the doorway seemed displeased, his sinister plans foiled by this unexpected intrusion. In a hurried escape, he turned and bolted down the hallway. Ignited by an adrenaline-fueled urgency, I sprinted down the dimly lit hallway, torn between the desperate desire to chase down the mysterious figure and the need to alert my sorority sisters to the impending danger. My pursuit was abruptly halted when I stumbled over an unforeseen obstruction on the floor. My trembling hands quickly found the lifeless body of one of my sisters sprawled on the floor, her once vibrant form now immersed in a chilling pool of crimson. A shudder of horror coursed through me, its icy grip intensifying as the dreadful reality of the night's gruesome events sank in. I screamed, and that was the last thing that I remembered from that terrible night. I had lost consciousness, and the next fragment of memory that I could grasp was awakening inside a hospital. The authorities were called, and a meticulous investigation into the night's harrowing events unfolded. Yet, despite their efforts, the identity of the malevolent intruder was never found. For a long time, I wrestled with the chilling thought that I had been the next target on his list. Halloween, a day I had always cherished for its excitement and joy, took an unexpected turn, becoming an occasion that I would come to dread for the rest of my life.
Story 11. A terrifying tale of isolation. This unsettling narrative takes root in a journey that began with excitement and the allure of the unknown, alongside an 8-man crew. However, destiny led me to be the sole survivor, stranded on a remote, deserted island. As the waves relentlessly pounded the ship's hull, a storm of unexpected magnitude erupted, a tempest that rendered the vessel and its crew helpless against nature's fury. Amid the chaos of the storm, the ship was tossed with relentless force by towering waves. Each crash carried an unmistakable weight, underscoring the insignificance of human endeavors when pitted against the forces of nature. The ship groaned and shuddered as if it were protesting its fate, and as day broke, the vessel found itself grounded on the unforgiving shores of an isolated island, with me as the sole survivor. The sun ascended with blistering intensity, casting harsh shadows that stretched across the barren landscape. What had begun as a promising adventure had deteriorated into a nightmare of solitude, accentuated by the absence of the crew's camaraderie. The island, its pale sands contrasting with the gnarled vegetation, extended in all directions, a stark manifestation of nature's capriciousness. The air hung heavy with a silence that seemed to envelop everything, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the mysteries concealed within the island's terrain. Days merged into nights, each one a repetitive cycle of isolation and a yearning for escape. I ventured along the shoreline, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of life, a glimmer of hope that remained frustratingly elusive. The waves persisted in their relentless assault on the shore, a ceaseless echo of the world beyond the island's edge. Yet the island itself remained void of visible activity, its silence an overwhelming presence. With the sun's descent, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The harsh shadows that danced across the landscape seemed to morph into a living entity, casting an eerie spell over the surroundings. Every rustle of leaves or distant sound carried a sense of significance, as if the island held secrets waiting to be unearthed. During the nights, I took refuge in a makeshift shelter, my thoughts reverberating like the waves that crashed against the shore. The island's aura seemed to intensify in the darkness, and a persistent notion emerged that I wasn't truly alone, that unseen eyes observed me from the shadows, that the island's mysteries were aware and observing. As time passed, the days melted into weeks, marked only by the rising and setting of the relentless sun. The island's desolation became a constant companion, and the silence that pervaded it transformed into a symphony of unanswered questions. Was this place genuinely deserted, or were secrets concealed beyond the veil of my perception? With each passing day, my desperation grew, igniting an urgent need to break free from the island's clutches. I searched tirelessly for any signs of deliverance, hoping to spot a ship on the horizon or the silhouette of a passing aircraft. Yet each day only revealed the same barren landscape and the unyielding waves. The island's isolation draped over me like a heavy shroud, a haunting testimony to the fragility of human existence amidst nature's vast expanse. As I stared out into the endless expanse of the ocean, I couldn't help but wonder if rescue would ever come. The isolation and solitude pressed upon me, leaving me grappling with the uncertainty of my fate. Would I ever be found, or would the island's silence become my eternal companion? Story 12. I was stalked by the beast of Bray Road. I grew up in northern Chicago, still live here and have many friends here. About 5 years ago, the best of my childhood friends moved to Madison, Wisconsin for a new job. A few weeks after he left, we had a discussion about me coming to visit him at his new place. Madison is northwest of where I live in Chicago, and a typical trip would take a little over 2 hours traveling west to Rockford, and then on north to Madison. You know, my friend said, instead of taking the quickest route from where you are, why don't you drive through Walworth County and try to spot the Beast of Bray Road? I couldn't help but laugh at the idea. The Beast of Bray Road was a legend, a creature said to lurk in the rural areas of Walworth County, resembling a werewolf or some other half-man, half-wolf monstrosity. As far as I was concerned, it was the stuff of campfire tales and late-night horror movies, not something to be taken seriously. I initially dismissed the idea, planning to take the usual route to Madison. That Friday night, though, as I was leaving from work and traveling home to gather my things for the weekend trip, a sense of adventure came over me. I thought, what the hell, and decided to take my friend's advice, just for the thrill of it. As I drove north towards Walworth County, the sun went down and darkness was now upon me. I reached Walworth County and turned right onto Bray Road, a desolate stretch of asphalt that mostly drives into nothing. Open fields, a few isolated houses, and some eerie cornfields is about all that there is to the road. I switched on my high beams and scanned back and forth as I was driving the little 4-mile stretch of road. As I reached the end of it, I saw exactly what I expected to see. Absolutely nothing. Instead of taking the quickest route back, I decided to give it one more go, and I cut a U-turn. I had backtracked back down the road about a mile when I heard a pop, and my car started to wobble a little bit. Immediately I knew I had a flat tire. I drive an old car and haven't been the best at taking care of it, especially the tires. I got out and walked around, and sure enough, it was a flat. I opened my trunk and retrieved the spare tire, only to discover that it was nearly flat itself. I stood there frustrated, partly because of my situation, and partly because I hadn't prepared for something like this. A car or two passed as I stood there trying to figure out what to do. Suddenly, a pickup truck pulled up beside me. The driver rolled down his window and asked if I was okay. I explained my situation and mentioned my low spare tire. The man said that he lived nearby and offered to retrieve an air pump to help me out. I was grateful and agreed. As he drove off, I climbed back into my car, intent on passing the time by checking my phone. Lost in all of this was my location. I had completely forgotten where I was. I was still on Bray Road. Minutes dragged on as I played on my phone, and then, suddenly, bang! A huge bang brought me to attention, and I looked around. There was nothing. I got out and walked around to the other side of my car to find a huge rock lying next to my car. I looked up and into the cornfields nearby, and that's when I saw it. At first, all I saw was glowing eyes. It was dark, but those eyes were piercing straight through the cornfields. I froze. As the eyes moved forward a little bit, I could make out the silhouette of what looked like a large dog. Then, before I could even process what was happening, it stood up. The eyes rose up above the cornstalks, and I could make out a body on this thing. It stood upright, like a human, but its face resembled that of a dog. It had arms and hands. It didn't have paws. It had hands. Its eyes were red, and it was growling at me. I absolutely freaked out and scrambled back into my car and locked the doors. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, it was like something bumped up against my car. Whatever this creature was, it seemed to be circling the vehicle. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I looked in my rearview mirror, and this thing was on all fours coming around the backside of my car. It looked like it was massive. I began honking the horn, hoping the loud noise would scare it off, but it didn't. I was screaming and not knowing what to do. I was trapped. My car was propped up on a jack and had no wheel on it. I was paralyzed with panic. As it was about to reach my driver's side door, headlights appeared over the hill in the distance. I began honking my horn and flashing my lights frantically, hoping that someone would stop. The truck began to slow, and I could see that it was the man who had stopped earlier, returning with the pump. I looked into my rearview mirror and the dog, or whatever it was, had disappeared. I recounted the horrifying encounter, my voice shaking as I spoke. The man looked at me with a puzzled expression, yet I felt like he knew exactly what I was talking about. "Well, let's get you changed up and out of here," the man said. As I filled my spare with air and changed out tires, the man kept an eye on the cornfields. Fortunately, we didn't hear or see anything else out of the ordinary. When I finally reached Madison and told my friend what had happened, he chuckled and dismissed everything that I had to say, chalking it up to nothing more than an entertaining story. But I knew better. I was there. I saw the beast of Bray Road. I know it's real, and I will never go back to that road ever again. Story 13. A horrifying intruder story. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting a warm, golden hue across my room. I stirred, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing against my eyelids. Something wasn't right. My stomach churned and twisted, an unfamiliar ache signaling that today wouldn't be a normal school day. I mustered the strength to sit up, the sheets tangling around my legs as I swung them over the side of the bed. The floor felt cold beneath my feet, and my head was spinning uncontrollably. As I stood, I paused for a moment, swaying unsteadily. The thought of facing a day at school seemed impossible. With a heavy sigh, I trudged downstairs, my steps dragging like lead. In the kitchen, I found my mother preparing breakfast. I mustered the strength to tell her I didn't feel well. She looked concerned but understanding, telling me I could stay home for the day before she left for work. I considered a slice of dry toast, but my queasy stomach protested even the thought of food. As my mother's car backed out of the driveway, I retreated back to my bedroom. I settled back onto my bed, wrapping myself in a cozy blanket. The TV played in the background, its murmur of voices providing a dull comfort. I tried to lose myself in the screen, hoping to forget the discomfort coursing through me. Minutes turned to hours, the day outside drifting into a muted gray. I was cocooned in the quiet of the house, the only sound my own shallow breaths and the faint whisper of the TV. It was then that I heard it, a slight bang that jolted my senses. I couldn't discern its origins, whether it came from inside or outside. My ears strained, desperately trying to capture any other sounds. At first, there was nothing but silence, but just as I began to relax back in, I began to hear faint creaking from below, like footsteps on the wooden floors. My heart quickened, beating a frantic rhythm in my chest. My eyes darted around the room, searching for some logical explanation. Maybe it was just the house settling, but the unease in my gut told me otherwise. I tiptoed to the edge of the staircase, peering down into the emptiness below. The air seemed colder there, carrying an unfamiliar tension. My fingers gripped the banister, knuckles turning white as I summoned the courage to descend. Each step felt like an eternity. The sounds grew clearer, more deliberate, like deliberate footsteps echoing through the silence. Panic surged through me, urging me to turn back, to retreat to the safety of my room. But something held me captive, an inexplicable need to uncover the truth. The lower floor greeted me with an unseen presence. I moved cautiously, my breath hitching at every unfamiliar sound. The living room stood empty, the curtains drawn tight against the outside light. I dared to peek into the kitchen, my heart pounding in my ears. Nothing. The rooms were as still as a photograph, frozen in time. Then, a muffled thud echoed through the house, distant yet unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of my mother's bedroom. Dread gripped me, threatening to pull me under, but my feet moved of their own accord. As I approached my mother's room, my heart began to pound uncontrollably, my breath caught in my throat. What I saw next would give me nightmares for years to come. Standing in my mother's room was a towering figure. His silhouette was tall and broad. The details of his face were obscured, but his eyes were visible, gleaming with an unsettling intensity, and staring directly into mine. Time seemed to stretch and warp around us. The weight of the moment pressed down on me like an oppressive force. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out even the faintest whisper of a sound. We stood there, eyes locked, a battle of wills that seemed to span an eternity. Then, with deliberate purpose, he took a step forward, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. A scream tore from my lips, an instinctual response to the encroaching danger. I raced back upstairs, fear gripping me. The belief that he was coming for me clung to my thoughts like a suffocating shroud. In one fluid motion, I hurtled through the threshold of my bedroom doorway, the momentum carrying me forward. Behind me, the door slammed shut with a resounding bang, sealing off the unknown presence that lurked on the other side of it. Panic surged through me, urging me to find shelter, to hide from the unseen threat that had breached the sanctity of my home. My eyes darted around the room, searching for a place of refuge, a stronghold to weather the storm of terror. Without hesitation, I lunged towards the closet, fingers fumbling to grasp the handle. The door swung open, revealing a narrow, confined space. In my haste, I squeezed myself inside, the scent of familiar clothes and shoes enveloping me. I shut the door and the darkness swallowed me whole, the confines of the closet providing a false sense of safety. I heard a thud, then another. I pressed my back against the closet wall, willing my breaths to steady. The seconds stretched into an agonizing crawl, time slowing as I waited, every nerve on edge. And then, nothing, only complete silence. I sat, motionless, straining with all my might to catch hold of any sound. But there was only silence. Minutes felt like hours, the silence oppressive, broken only by the steady rhythm of my breaths. The tension was unbearable, a suffocating weight on my chest. And then, just as quickly as the sounds had faded, they returned. Disbelief washed over me. I had thought the intruder had left. I could hear the footsteps approaching, ascending the stairs. As the footsteps drew closer, a terrifying thought pierced straight through my heart. In my haste to make for the closet, I had forgotten to lock the bedroom door. I pressed my trembling hands against the fabric of my clothes, a futile attempt to silence the involuntary tremors that had taken hold of me. Then, the creak of my bedroom door sent fresh waves of terror coursing through me. Tears welled in my eyes, but I bit my lip to stifle any sound. Footsteps drew nearer, each one echoing like a death knell. The sounds of movement and activity reached a fever pitch, filling the air with a chaotic symphony. It was a haunting contrast to the oppressive silence that had reigned just moments before. My heart raced, pounding against my ribs like a desperate plea for escape. I could hardly believe it. My tormentor was still present, refusing to yield to the passage of time. I was frozen, a statue of fear, my senses heightened to a painful intensity. The footsteps drew nearer, each one a menacing cadence that seemed to reverberate through the room. I pressed myself further into the closet, willing the darkness to swallow me whole. Then, with agonizing slowness, the doorknob turned, the door inching open. My breath caught in my throat, my eyes squeezed shut in a desperate bid for invisibility. It was the moment of truth. As the door swung open, a shaft of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the cramped confines of my hiding place. It was my mother, her face etched with concern and relief. She had come home early from work, her presence a beacon of salvation in the midst of my terror. She rushed towards me, her arms enveloping me in a tight embrace. I could feel her heart beating against my own, a reassuring rhythm that anchored me to reality. She asked what was wrong, her voice a soothing balm against the chaos that had unfolded. I recounted the harrowing encounter, each word a tremor in the stillness. Her grip on me tightened, a silent promise of protection and reassurance. With unwavering resolve, she reached for her phone, dialing the numbers to report the intrusion. The police were on their way, determined to unravel the mystery of the man in the shadows. An investigation ensued, casting its net wide, but the intruder proved as elusive as smoke in the wind, leaving behind no trace, no clue to unravel the mystery. It was as if he had never truly been there, a phantom slipping through the fingers of those who sought him. With each passing day, the initial shock and fear began to ebb, replaced by a lingering unease. Our home, once a sanctuary, bore the weight of that day's terror in its very foundation. Every creak and whisper seemed to carry an echo of that chilling presence. Yet, amidst the shadows of fear, there emerged a beacon of strength. My mother's love shone brightly, a steadfast pillar of support and protection. Her determination to keep us safe was unwavering, a testament to the fierce resilience of a mother's heart. Story 14. Alone in the Office. The dim hum of fluorescent lights overhead was all I could hear. The office was vast, open plan, and at this hour, eerily silent. I stayed late, really late, to catch up on a very important project, believing the stillness would help me concentrate. But as hours slipped away, the expansive floor filled not with peacefulness, but with a sense of unease. From my desk, I could see row after row of empty chairs and vacant cubicles. In the daytime, this place buzzed with activity, voices melding into a noise of workplace banter. But now, the silence was harsh. Around 10 p.m., my phone buzzed, a message notification. The screen displayed an unknown number. Enjoying the peace? I frowned. Perhaps it was someone from work, although the contact should have been saved. I typed back, "Who is this?" But there was no response. Shaking off a mild sense of anxiety, I decided to head to the break room for a coffee. As I passed through the maze of workstations, the hairs on my neck prickled. I felt observed, even though the office was supposedly empty. The break room's light was faulty, flickering intermittently, a nice spooky touch to an already creepy situation. As the coffee machine gurgled to life, another message appeared on my phone. "It's better in the dark." I felt a chill. I wasn't amused at all. Holding my phone tightly, I responded, "Who are you? This isn't funny." Instead of typing, the messenger sent an audio clip. Hesitantly, I played it. It was a recording of my own voice from earlier in the evening, speaking to a colleague. "I'll be staying late tonight. Don't wait up." Swallowing hard, I realized that whoever this was had been here, had been close enough to record my conversation. Panic gnawed at me. I needed to leave. I darted back to my desk to grab my belongings. On my way, I thought I caught a fleeting glimpse of someone in my periphery, just beyond the glow of the exit sign, but I couldn't tell if someone was really there, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. At my desk, I quickly shut down my computer and stuffed my papers into my bag. I heard a soft ping from my phone. Why the rush? We're only just getting acquainted. With adrenaline coursing through me, I bolted for the stairs, avoiding the elevators, too slow and too unpredictable. As I ran, I dialed the police. The operator's voice was calm as I explained my situation. She advised me to exit the building and wait in a safe place. As I reached the ground floor, I stole a glance behind me. There was nothing, just the quiet expanse of the office, the occasional flickering light, and that oppressive silence. I sprinted across the lobby and out into the chilly night. Gasping for breath, I looked around. The parking lot, dimly lit by the scattered street lamps, was empty. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the only sign of life in the desolate scene. The police arrived within minutes, their blue and red lights breaking the stillness. They swept the building but found no one. My manager was informed, and after checking the security camera footage, he confirmed that no one had entered or left the building after me. The messages, they said, could have been someone's idea of a cruel joke, perhaps a co-worker, but they took them seriously, especially given the voice recording. Weeks passed. The fear gradually faded, replaced by a low-grade paranoia. Every evening as the office emptied, I'd get that familiar unease, making me leave with the last group of colleagues. It was during one of those evenings, as a coworker and I shared an elevator to the parking lot, that she looked at me and said, "You know, I once stayed late here, just once. I felt watched the entire time." I stared at her, my pulse quickening. "Did anything happen?" She shook her head. "No messages or anything, just that feeling, like I wasn't really alone." The police never identified the number that texted me, saying it was likely a burner phone. As I think back to that night, and I think about the messages and the unknown individual, I find myself trying to determine what is more terrifying: the feeling of being completely alone in that vast office, or the chilling doubt that perhaps I never truly was when I should have been. Story 15. A Night at Crybaby Bridge. You know, every town has its legends, those tales that parents use to scare their kids into behaving, or stories teenagers dare each other to explore. In my small town, just 3 miles northwest of Monmouth, Illinois, we had the Crybaby Bridge. For as long as I can remember, older kids would tell us the gruesome tale of the school bus tragedy at the bridge. It was said that many years ago, during a particularly harsh rainstorm, an elementary school bus, filled with innocent children, met its doom there. A sudden flash flood washed the bridge out, and the bus, unable to stop in time, plunged off the side. Every single child on board was claimed by the raging waters, but that's not the end of the story. Legend says that the spirits of those kids never left. It was rumored that if you positioned your car at the start of the bridge precisely at midnight and placed it into neutral, those same children would muster their ethereal strength to push your vehicle across. And if you were brave, or perhaps foolish, enough to sprinkle baby powder on your bumper, you'd see their tiny handprints as proof of their presence. My friends and I, we never really bought into the legend, maybe because we thought we were too rational, too logical. But on Halloween night in 2006, a part of us wanted to see if there was any truth to it. We decided to take Mark's Jeep, big enough to fit all 4 of us, and old enough that we wouldn't be devastated if it got a scratch or two. As we approached the bridge, we shared light-hearted banter, laughing off our mild anxieties. The clock ticked closer to midnight. Following the ritual as we had heard it, I sprinkled baby powder all over the Jeep's bumper. We all inspected it, making sure every inch was covered, half expecting to see some marks already. But there was nothing, just the smooth white powder. Mark, in a dramatic fashion, aligned the Jeep at the start of the bridge. He placed the car into neutral and revved the engine, heightening our heart rates. Then we sat and waited. For something. Anything. Minutes felt like hours. Nothing happened. We all started laughing, chastising ourselves for even thinking this could be real. I remember my friend Sarah joking about how she'd have a better chance finding a ghost in her attic. We were on the brink of giving up, labeling this as another failed adventure when it began. It started as a faint, distant sobbing. "Is that a baby?" Mark whispered, but the sound grew, evolving into multiple cries, a mixture of countless voices, each one louder and more distressed than the last. Our chuckles died down instantly. Suddenly the Jeep lurched forward. It was subtle at first, like when you think you've forgotten to put your car in park. But then it quickly gained momentum. The wheels rolled over the old tarmac, and the once distant cries now sounded like they were right inside our car. My heart raced, every cry penetrating my ears, every sob tearing at my soul. In our panic, none of us thought to stop the car. It felt like we were in the clutches of an unseen force, hurtling us with increasing speed towards the other side of the bridge. Our laughter had been replaced with screams, our skepticism with pure, unadulterated terror. The Jeep accelerated quickly, faster and faster, until with one final jolt, it came to a halt, having crashed into the protective barrier on the other side of the bridge. We sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Our breaths were ragged, our hands shaking. As the reality of our situation sank in, We slowly stepped out, inspecting the Jeep for damage. That's when we saw them. On the baby-powdered bumper were dozens of tiny handprints, clear against the white backdrop. Handprints of children who had met their untimely end on that very bridge. The undeniable proof was right there in front of our eyes. We hopped back into the Jeep and drove back into town. It was quiet the entire way back. Honestly, I think we were all just too shaken to say much. Even now, years after the event, we reflect back and try to come to terms with it. The four of us don't talk about that night much. The weight of it hangs on us. I'm sharing this now, not as a dare or challenge, but as a warning. Some legends, no matter how unbelievable they seem, hold a grain of truth. Crybaby Bridge is real. Those children, they're still there, waiting. If you ever find yourself in Monmouth and hear the tale of Crybaby Bridge, remember our story. Respect the legend, and whatever you do, don't venture there at midnight. Story 16. The Scariest Repairman Story. I've worked as a repairman for the last 3 years. Ever since I got out of high school, I've not been that eager to go get a 9-to-5 job or flip burgers or anything like that. I like being on my own time with minimal supervision. Being a repairman works out great for me. I can take odd jobs here and there while I try to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. One day I got a call from a friend who said that he knew someone that had just bought some land and needed somebody to gut an abandoned building on the property. Not exactly a repair job, depending on how you look at it, but after getting all the details I agreed and took the job. The project was to gut an abandoned church so that it could be converted into something else. A storage building? A cabin? I didn't know and didn't really care. My job was to gut it down to its bones, and then from there, it was somebody else's problem. When I pulled in the first day, I immediately got the creeps. The church sat at the end of a long dirt driveway, off a road less traveled, and in the middle of nowhere. Looking at the building, it wasn't very large, but I was a one-man crew, so I figured it would take at least 3 days to get gutted out. The moment I stepped inside, the place felt off. It still had that typical abandoned building feel, though. Graffiti on the wall, broken glass, and cigarette butts on the floor, the usual. After giving the place a brief look around, I started unloading tools and got to work. Nothing unusual the first morning. I worked until noon and then drove into town to get a bite to eat for lunch. When I came back, however, there were the first signs that something was going on. Some of my tools had been moved. At first I just chalked it up to absent-mindedness. Maybe I moved them myself and just wasn't paying attention. But then I noticed that some of them were laying in the front yard. I definitely didn't do that. Someone for sure had to have been there. Thinking about the graffiti and cigarette butts, I told myself it was probably a couple of stupid kids and went about my business, though I was a little bit more on alert. The rest of the day went by without any issues, and I turned in before it started getting dark. I packed up my expensive tools but left some of the larger things. A ladder, a chair, and a fold-out table, just to name a few. When I returned the next day, it again felt like someone had been there. The ladder that I had left leaning up against the wall was now in the floor, and my chair was tipped over. I was part annoyed, and part spooked as well. This place was out in the middle of nowhere, and it had such a creepy vibe. The building itself, the land, its location, it all made my skin crawl, just to be honest. I didn't feel that there was much that I could do about it, so I just straightened everything up and got back to work. This day was a little bit different, though. I started hearing strange noises. At first they were coming from the nearby woods, then it sounded like they were coming from right outside the church. I'd look around and there was nothing. I repeatedly told myself not to worry about it. Maybe it was just a deer or something. I think deep down inside, though, I knew something was way off about this place. Again, I finished up before dark and headed out. The next day, I brought out a generator. I wanted to be done with this place, and I anticipated that I might be working a little bit later in order to finish up and not have to come back again the next day. I worked as quickly as I could the entire day. I kept one eye on what I was working on and another on my surroundings. As it got later into the evening and the sun started going down, I took a moment to weigh my options. I could either hook my lights up to the generator, work late into the night, and get everything done, or come back the next morning to finish up. I wanted out of this place, so I figured I'd just hook the lights up and get it done. It would be a decision that I would later regret. It was dark now, and I only had a few more hours of work left. I was grinding away when out of nowhere, the generator cut out and the lights along with it. It was almost pitch black. It happened so quickly that my eyes didn't have time to adjust to the darkness, if that makes sense. My first thought was that the generator had run out of gas. But then I thought to myself, that's impossible. I just filled it up, and there's no way it could have used all of the gas up already. I was somewhat puzzled. As I was trying to make my way over to the generator, it happened. I heard a young woman's voice. It was slithery, it was terrifying, and it said one word. Leave. I spun around. I'm the type of person that reacts aggressively when I'm frightened. My words get loud and deep. I stand erect and puff out my chest and try to intimidate back whatever is frightening me. But deep down inside, I'm shaking to my core. Who the freak is freaking with me? I yelled out, except I didn't use the word freak, if you know what I mean. For a second, there was nothing. It was dead quiet. What happened next, though, would have me questioning what reality is for the rest of my life. In my peripheral, I saw some movement, barely illuminated by what little bit of moonlight there was. I turned my head to look over. In the corner of the house was a figure, best as I could describe. It looked to be a young woman. Her hair was parted straight down the middle. Her clothes were tattered and looked to be from the late 1800s or early 1900s. She looked menacing and didn't look like she was happy at all. But what really got me were the eyes. You see, there were none. They were dark and hollow, and there was absolutely nothing where the eyes should have been. Before I could even process my own thoughts, my legs were ushering me out the front door. I was screaming hysterically. Not something I want to admit, but if I'm going to tell my story the way that it happened, then that's what happened. I jumped into my old pickup truck and started scrambling for my keys. I couldn't find them. I started to hyperventilate as I was looking for them. Then I realized something. I had left them, along with my phone, on the fold-up table inside the church. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had two choices. Either make a mad dash back in there to retrieve them, or make a mad dash down the dirt driveway on foot. Whichever option I chose would require that it be done in near pitch-black darkness. I opted for the keys and the phone. I felt like it gave me a better chance to get out of there more quickly. The other option left me running down a long, dark road in the middle of nowhere. I threw the driver's side door open, ran back in as quickly as I could, and dove for my keys and phone. Luckily, my eyes had somewhat adjusted to the darkness now, and I could make out where the table was. Pivoting to head back towards my truck, I took a glance at the corner that this woman, or whatever you want to call it, was. There was nothing. She, or it, or whatever it was gone. Part of me was relieved, and the other part was gripped with fear. If she wasn't there in the corner, where was she? I didn't want to waste any more time trying to figure it out. I burst back out the front door and back into my truck. I hit the ignition and it fired up with no issues. I threw it in reverse and mashed the gas pedal to the floorboard. I cut a 180, and when my truck came to a stop, she was there, in my headlights, about 15 feet away, directly in front of me. This time, every ounce of detail was visible. Just as I had seen before, she had long dark hair. She was wearing a tattered dress, and her eyes were completely hollow. There was one other detail this time, though. Where there should have been feet, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. She was floating about 6 inches off the ground. Where there should have been feet coming out of the bottom of her dress, there was nothing. I screamed out, "What the?" and the F word. I raised my left hand up over my eyes with my palm turned outwards, kind of the way that someone would raise up their hand to look in the direction of a really bright light, or the sun or something. It was instinctual. I didn't even really think about it. I guess part of me didn't want to see what was about to happen next. I wanted out of there. She was between me and my exit, and I wasn't going to take any more time making any more decisions. I slammed on the gas and headed straight for her. With my hand up blocking my view, I squinted a little bit, anticipating some type of impact or thud or something. But as I accelerated forward, there was nothing. No thud, no bump, No scream. Nothing. All I could hear was the sound of gravel and dirt being launched from my back tires. As I darted forward for what felt like probably 60 or 70 feet, I finally put my hand down, and all I could see out in front of me was the dirt driveway. I glanced into my rearview mirror and saw nothing. I flew down the driveway, out onto the road, and drove straight home in record time. The rest of the night was a daze. When my adrenaline dump finally wore down, I was completely exhausted, but at the same time, I was too terrified to sleep. At some point, though, I guess the exhaustion got the better of me because I finally passed out. The next morning, I called in to the property owner. I told him that I couldn't make it back because I was sick. At the time, I didn't feel like it was a lie. The events of the prior night had left me completely out of it, and there was no force on earth that could get me to go back to that property. We had a brief discussion, and I detailed to him what little work was left to do. After a little bit of back and forth, we came to an agreement that the job was done. I made no mention of the woman or the events of that night. I didn't want to sound crazy, and I wasn't going back, so as far as I was concerned, that building was now somebody else's problem. Later that day, I called my friend and told him the same thing. I was sick. I asked if he could retrieve my gear. I had left behind the generator, lights, and all kinds of tools. I did feel bad about that request, sending my friend out there to risk running into whatever that thing was. But again, at the time I was out of my mind, and there was no way I was stepping foot back on that property. Luckily, my friend was able to retrieve my gear without incident. I will never ever forget what I saw that night. Up until this point, I've refrained from using the word ghost. I've never believed in that kind of stuff, but I know what I saw, and I don't know what else I would call it. I will tell you one thing, though. Flipping burgers suddenly doesn't sound like that bad of a gig. Story 17. The Mysterious Tent. The following is a story that happened to me and my friends about 4 years ago. My friends Alex and Chris and I headed to a remote part of the Sierra Nevada to go camping and fishing. We had been in this spot before and very much enjoyed it, so we decided to go back and make a weekend of it. Well, I wouldn't be telling this story if something incredibly creepy didn't happen. We had trekked deep into the forest to our spot. We loved it because we would be far from anybody else. Just the three of us, and the serene beauty of nature, that type of thing, you know? On the second day, we set out to go fishing. All was well. We traveled up the river some and had a blast. A few hours before sunset, we decided that we should get back so that we could get a fire going before dark. When we got back to the campsite, we noticed that there was another tent oddly close to ours. Uncomfortably close, maybe 75 to 80 feet away. It was a plain old tent, with no other camping equipment in sight. Our first impressions were ones of annoyance. We were out in the middle of nowhere, and of all the places that someone could throw up a tent, they do it here, right next to ours. Out of courtesy, though, we approached the tent, calling out a greeting. No response. We called again, and again, nothing. It appeared that no one was there. Finally, Chris came across and said that he was going to take a look inside. "Best not," I said. But before I could even finish, he was making his way over. He walked over, slowly and cautiously. When he reached the door, he slowly unzipped it. "What do you see?" Alex asked. "Nothing," Chris replied. "What do you mean?" I said. "I mean, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing inside." We were all confused, but assumed the occupant was out exploring or something, so we went about our day, trying to shrug off the unease. It got darker and darker and darker. As we went about our business, we kept making glances over at the tent, expecting someone to show up at some point. We had gotten lost in our own affairs when out of nowhere, a light flicked on from the inside of the tent. Inside was the silhouette of a single person that we could see. We all looked at each other. Nobody ever saw anybody walk over and into the tent. At this point, the creepiness was off the charts. We didn't expect for things to get any creepier, but they did. "Go say something," Chris said to me. "What do you want me to say?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "Anything." I hesitated but finally gave in. I walked over slowly, watching the silhouette the entire time. It was motionless, just sitting there in the middle of the tent doing nothing. I got closer and closer. My heart was pounding out of my chest. When I got within about 15 feet, just as I was about to speak up, I could see the head of this person, or whatever it was, begin to turn slowly, like it was looking over in my direction. I looked back at the guys, and they were motioning for me to continue. I turned back towards the tent, and just as I was about to speak out, a blood-curdling scream came from within the tent. Before I could even realize it, I had turned and was running back towards the guys. We were all in a panic at this point. What just happened? Who was this person? What in the hell is going on? We argued amongst ourselves, frantically trying to decide what to do. As we did, I reached into my pocket to grab my phone. 0 reception. Not even a single bar. It was the dead of night now. We were out in the middle of nowhere, had no cell phone reception, and there was a mysterious tent 75 feet away from us with an unknown occupant that had let out a scream like none of us had ever heard before. We were absolutely terrified. As we argued about what to do, there was motion from within the tent. The silhouette appeared to be looking in our direction still, though it was difficult to tell. It said nothing. Then, after a few seconds, it looked like this person was raising their arm up to the top of the tent. We were all wide-eyed, locked into the motion coming from within the tent. And then, out of nowhere, the light inside the tent went out. "What in the hell? What in the hell?" we were all saying to each other. Questions were flying, but we had no answers. None of us knew what to do. We had gear and supplies and tents everywhere, and we were miles from our vehicle. We went back and forth trying to figure out what to do. Finally, we decided that we would go ahead and stay the night, and wait until daylight to try to make sense out of everything. From there, we would just leave altogether, if the unknown person had not yet made contact with us. However, we would take shifts with one of us staying awake to watch over the creepy visitor. "Keep the fire going," I said. The other two agreed. Alex was first up. At around 1 a.m., Alex woke up Chris. As they told me, they switched shifts with no new events taking place. As far as they knew, the weird person was still in the tent. Surprisingly, I managed to get some sleep. It wasn't enough, though. Chris woke me up at 4 a.m., and I was to take over until daylight. As Alex crawled into his tent, I threw more wood on the fire. I remember sitting there, wide awake at first. The fire was nice. It provided some comfort, in contrast to our unknown visitor. I remember watching the tent for any movement. Nothing. I would watch the fire for a little while, and then look over at the tent. I did this over and over and over. I remember getting more and more tired. After about an hour or so, I was struggling to stay awake. I would doze off, just to catch myself, and then doze off again. Finally, fatigue won over, and I fell asleep. The next thing I remember is that it was daylight and Chris was shaking me. "Wake up, what the hell?" he said. "Where did the person go?" I looked over to the mysterious tent. There was nothing. It was gone. "You fell asleep?" Chris said in somewhat of an annoyed voice. At this point, Alex was making his way out of his tent. "Where'd they go?" he said. "I don't know," I replied. We searched for any sign of the person. There was nothing, not even footprints. It was like they were never there in the first place. At this point, we had enough. It was daylight now, so we began to pack our things. We weren't going to wait around to see if the person returned. We were exhausted when we arrived back home. It was a trip that we will never forget. To this day, we have no idea who the person was, or what their intentions were. Was it some sick prank? Was someone trying to scare us off of the spot for good? Unfortunately, we may never know. We never went back to that spot again. It's a shame. It was one of our favorites. Story 18. Unearthed Secrets, a haunting cold case. It's not every day that a medical examiner is called to revisit a long-forgotten cold case. The details of this particular case had faded into obscurity, buried in the dusty archives of a small-town police department. But then, out of nowhere, a detective called me, requesting my expertise. He believed there was more to this unsolved mystery than what met the eye, and I was about to discover just how chillingly accurate his suspicions were. The cemetery, bathed in the eerie glow of a waning moon, seemed like an unusual place to start investigating a crime. but there I was, shivering as the cool night air settled around me. The detective, a tall, shadowy figure in a trench coat, stood beside me, his breath visible in the cold. "Dr. Anderson," he began, "I hope you're ready to delve into a mystery that's been haunting this town for years." I nodded, pulling my lab coat tighter around me. "I'm all ears. Detective?" "Call me Detective Granger," he replied. Detective Granger then led me to a particular grave, worn and forgotten, just like the case itself. We watched as the gravediggers worked by the dim light of their lanterns, carefully uncovering the wooden casket that held the victim's remains. It was the coffin of Amelia Thornton, a woman whose death had puzzled the town for decades. As I observed the exhumation, a feeling of dread crept over me. I had handled numerous autopsies, but something about this case felt different, more ominous. Detective Granger had a theory that Amelia had been poisoned, and new evidence had given him the urge to unearth the truth. The coffin was eventually lifted from its resting place, revealing the rotting wood. With a sense of unease, I approached it, and with gloved hands, began the painstaking process of opening it. The creaking of the coffin lid seemed deafening in the quiet cemetery, and I could feel the eyes of the detective burning into my back. Inside the coffin lay the body of Amelia Thornton. She was dressed in a tattered gown, her pale skin oddly preserved, given the years that had passed. Her features, though weathered, were eerily lifelike. I could almost imagine her breathing, the cold air causing her chest to rise and fall. Carefully, I examined her remains, collecting samples for toxicology testing. Detective Granger watched my every move, his face etched with anticipation. As I worked, I couldn't help but feel as though Amelia's lifeless eyes were following me, accusing me of disturbing her eternal slumber. Hours turned into an eternity as I meticulously dissected the body, looking for any trace of poison. The detective's patience wore thin, and he finally spoke. "Dr. Anderson, there's something you need to see." His voice trembled as he pointed to the inside of the coffin. I turned my gaze toward the dark interior of the casket. My heart skipped a beat as I saw it. Deep, parallel gouges, like the desperate clawing of fingernails, etched into the wood. They were unmistakable, evidence of a horrifying truth. Amelia Thornton had been buried alive, left to struggle and suffer beneath the earth's suffocating embrace. She had clawed and scratched, desperately trying to escape her premature grave. The detective and I exchanged horrified glances, realizing that this cold case had just taken an unthinkable turn. As we closed the coffin and left the cemetery, the chilling memory of those fingernail marks stayed with me, a reminder that some mysteries were better left buried. Detective Granger and I had unearthed a secret that would haunt us for the rest of our lives, a truth that went far beyond the realm of the natural. The events of that night changed me, and I couldn't help but wonder if Amelia Thornton's restless spirit was still seeking justice, or if something far more sinister lurked in the shadows of that forgotten cemetery, waiting to reveal itself once more. Story 19. A terrifying police officer story. I was a police officer for over 20 years. I've responded to countless calls, and after a while they start to blend into one another. Having moved on now, I'm often asked, "What's the one story or call that you can remember from your time on the force?" Hands down, it was the call about the cat, one that you'll never believe, one that I've told to very few people because I always figure that no one will believe me. It was the dead of winter, an overcast day, gloomy. Right after lunch, my new partner and I got a call about a guy, just out on the outskirts of town, going hysterical over some cat. My partner was a newbie, a rookie, and this was just his second day. Great, I thought to myself, an easy one to get the rookie's feet wet. The call came in from a woman stating that her neighbor was, quote-unquote, losing his mind over a cat. The guy was screaming, acting erratic, going in and out of the house. When we pulled up to the house, the front door was wide open, and we could see movement in the darkness of the interior. As we exited our vehicle, we could hear the man screaming from inside. As we began making our way over, the man burst out of the front door and into the yard. He was wearing nothing but his underwear. His eyes were wild, and he was waving his arms around and shouting about a cat. His skin was sickly, like he hadn't seen a shower or sunlight in days. His screams were mostly incoherent, but we managed to pick out a few phrases. "That cat! I want it gone, and I want it out." My partner and I exchanged looks as we tried to calm the man down. Usually we could predict how situations like this might pan out, most likely a drug-induced episode or a severe mental breakdown. But something about this was different. The raw fear in the man's voice was real. Having succeeded in tampering the man down, his screams were now just weird murmurs and mumbles. His movements were still erratic, but non-violent. It appeared that we had done well to de-escalate the situation some. "Should we get this guy an ambulance?" my partner asked. "Probably wouldn't hurt," I said. Leaning towards the man, I gently grabbed his arm with my hand. "Hey man, we got some people coming. We're gonna get you checked out, okay? Let's get you in the car where it's warm until they can get here and take a look at you," I remember saying. My partner ushered the man into the back of the car, and I popped the trunk to grab a blanket. As I was making my way back over, I saw the neighbor at a distance. Handing the blanket over to my partner, I told him to go ahead and call the ambulance in while I spoke with the neighbor. He nodded and grabbed the blanket. I didn't get much out of the neighbor. I spoke with her for a few minutes, and she said that she felt like the guy was deteriorating over the last few months. Every time she would see him, he looked like he was getting worse and worse. "Anybody else over there?" I asked her. "Nope, I've only seen the guy." "What about a cat?" I asked. "I haven't seen a cat," she said as the ambulance rolled up. I thanked the neighbor and walked back over to my partner. Having transferred responsibility of the man over to the paramedics, my partner looked at me and motioned to the house. "Should we see if we can find this damn cat?" he asked. "Wouldn't hurt to check the place out," I said. As the paramedics worked on the guy, we made our way to the front door. We should have turned back right then. Stepping inside, the house felt completely off. It was dark, beat up and run down. The place was filthy, mold crawling up the walls, garbage thrown across the floor, and it just had a smell of decay. Stepping inside was like stepping into a portal. It was depressing, and it was cold in there too. The first thing that I noticed that was out of place was the flies. Lots of them. This didn't make any sense because it was the dead of winter, and again it was freezing in there. How could there be flies, this many of them, and in the middle of winter? We made our way around the trash in the living room and into the kitchen. Nothing. No cat. Making our way over to the entrance to the hallway, there appeared to be 3 bedroom doors and a door to a bathroom. "You check out these 2 rooms, and I'll get the bathroom and the bedroom at the end of the hall," I said to my partner. "Got it," he said. I made my way down slowly, retrieving my flashlight to assist me. It was so dark and disgusting. We had our guard up too. The neighbor said there was no one else, but you can't ever be sure unless you check for yourself. The bathroom produced nothing but a tub, sink, and toilet that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in 10 years. "I got nothing in here," my partner said. "There's not even a bed, just trash and clutter," he said. I responded, "All right, we'll check that other room, and I'll check this last one, and we can get the hell out of here." As I made my way over to the room at the end of the hall, I remember thinking about how eerie and quiet the place was. All I could hear was my partner's footsteps, along with my own, and the sound of flies as they buzzed around my head. The last bedroom was as bad as I thought it was going to be. The lights didn't work. There was a disgusting stained mattress, more trash everywhere, and blankets covering the windows. As I walked into the room, I picked up the sound of something scuffling around on the other side of the bed, on the floor. "That damn cat," I thought to myself. I began to slowly walk around to investigate with my flashlight scanning the floor. Just as I was making my way around the foot of the bed, something darted over from the other side of the bed and into the opened closet. It was small, black, and skimmed across the floor like it was floating. The speed of this thing threw me, but I got a look at it and saw where it went. "Think I got it," I said to my partner. I could hear him walking down the hall now. As he did, I slowly creeped around to get a look at this thing. My flashlight inched across the floor and finally made its way into the closet. It revealed, to my surprise, absolutely nothing. Other than a single shoe and a food wrapper on the floor, there was absolutely nothing. No clothes, no cat, nothing. "What you got?" my partner, now standing beside me, asked. Wait, I said. I saw it run in here. It ran into this closet. I was so confused. I know I saw it run in there, but it wasn't there. You sure? My partner asked. Yeah, man, I saw it. It ran in here. Both of us just stared at the empty closet, confused. My partner said. Should we? Before he could finish, I cut him off. Yeah, I guess it's nothing. Let's get the hell out of here. I scanned the closet again one last time, up and down, side to side. I was sure that I had seen it run in there. I couldn't get over the fact that there was nothing. Both of us turned and walked to the bedroom doorway. He was in front of me, and as we rounded the corner, it darted across the other end of the hall, like it was going from the living room to the kitchen. Did you see it? My partner asked. Yeah, I said, having caught just a glimpse of it as I was turning into the hallway. It's in the kitchen, he said. We hurried down the hall and rounded the corner into the kitchen, and that's when we saw it. It was sitting on the floor, staring directly at us. It was thin and emaciated. You could see the thin skin crawling over its rib bones as it breathed. It was jet black and had no hair. It also looked like it didn't have a tail. It had long, skinny legs and just sat there locked onto us. Its eyes fogged over like it was blind, but we knew it could see us, and it was looking straight through us. My partner and I just froze. We didn't say anything. I think the sight of it just threw us off. We were thinking that we'd see a cat, with fur, meowing and purring, but this thing was none of those things. I'm not sure that it could even be considered a cat, but I guess that's the closest thing that it could be called. What it did next, though, shocked both of us and sent us scrambling. It was sitting on the floor, maybe about 2 to 2.5 feet in front of a thin strip of flat wall between the cabinets in the kitchen. It turned around, walked towards the wall, and then straight up the wall. Now, when I say it walked straight up the wall, I mean it walked. It didn't jump, and then claw at the wall and pull itself up and push with its hind legs. When it reached the wall, it stood up on its 2 hind legs, placed its front legs on the wall, and then just walked up the wall like it was part of the floor. When it got to the top, it turned, and then walked up on top of the cabinets to its right. It was like gravity didn't exist for this thing. Flies were everywhere now. There had to have been 50 of them. They were all over everything. Us, the counters, the cabinets, and the walls. Everywhere. This thing walked up onto the top of the cabinets and started walking back towards us in our direction. It took about 3 or 4 steps, and then it paused, just for a split second, and looked at us. Then it turned its head to the left and walked straight into the wall beside it. It disappeared. Gone. Into the wall. Not a hole in the wall. Straight into the wall beside it. It happened so quickly, neither of us had time to process it. We went from curiosity to panic in a split second. I jolted back and my partner flew back and stumbled over the couch. He started screaming, just like the man we pulled up on. What the F, and holy, well, you know, is about all I could say. Both of us flew out the front door. We moved so fast that we were knocking things over left and right. What the F was that? What the F was that? My partner was asking in a panic. I don't know, man, I replied back. Both of us stumbled back to the car, not taking our eyes off of the front door of that house. Did you see that? My partner asked. Yeah, I effing saw it, I said back. Other than the panicked breathing coming from the both of us, most of the drive back to the station was silent, like we were both just trying to process what we just saw. When we got to the station, we didn't say anything to anybody. We drew lots of looks and had 2 or 3 people ask if we were good, but neither of us said anything because we didn't want to look nuts. It's not a good look for police officers to be talking about disappearing cats. Honestly, the rest of the day was a blur. The next day, I got in a little early. I didn't get a lot of sleep that night, and I was awake anyways, so I just decided that I'd get in and get back to work, and maybe normalcy would settle back in. I was there for a little bit when I got a call from my partner. Hey man, I'm not coming back in, he said. I don't think this work is for me. Listen, I said, this isn't the type of thing that we typically... And before I could even finish, he cut me off. I know, he said, but I'm done. I'm going to look for something else to do. And just like that, he was done. Didn't even make it to day 3. I stayed on the force for another 6 years before calling it quits myself. Never had another experience like it, thankfully. I got word that the man from the house was there another 2 weeks or so, and then split. Moved out of state or something. The house, it's still there. Boarded up and abandoned. That cat or whatever it is it still there? I got no idea. I'll tell you one thing, though. I'm not ever going back there to find out. Story 20. The Light in Mrs. Jackson's Room. This is one of the craziest stories you'll ever hear. It happened to me about 11 years ago. It was around 1:30 a.m. and I was making my way down the hall of a nursing home. I was a maintenance man and was doing some work in the kitchen. I needed to get it done overnight so that the kitchen would be available for regular operation during the day. Anyways, I was walking down a hall back to the kitchen after retrieving some tools from my truck. As I passed one of the rooms, its light suddenly flicked on. I paused, stepped back a bit, and peered inside. When I looked inside, a couple of things felt off. An old woman was sitting quietly in a chair, staring at the wall. It was peculiar because the room was nearly empty. It only really had the chair that she was sitting in, a bed, and not much else. The second thing that felt weird is that as old and fragile as the woman looked, it was odd to me that she was able to flick on the light and get in the chair so quickly. I noticed too that her bed was completely made, not a wrinkle on it. Rather than knocking on the door or saying anything to the old woman, I felt like it wasn't my place. I was a maintenance man there to do a job and not be concerned with the affairs of the residents. Instead, I continued walking down the hall and notified a staff member. The staff member and I looked back down the hall together, only to see that the room was dark again. At this point, confusion was really starting to set in. "The fifth door on the right," I said to the staff member. "Mrs. Jackson's room?" she asked. I looked at her and said that I had no idea because I had no idea who Mrs. Jackson was. We walked down to the room together and the staff member flicked on the lights. There was nobody there. The room was completely empty. "Are you sure it was this room?" the staff member asked. "Yes," I said. "There was an old woman sitting in that chair and she was just staring at that wall and the lights were on." Finally, the staff member looked at me and said, "This is Mrs. Jackson's room. She died 2 days ago." I literally felt my blood run cold. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Yes," she said. We both just stood there and looked at each other. It was like both of us were trying to process what each of us was saying to each other. Finally, I didn't know what else to do or say, so I just said that I was going to finish up in the kitchen, and we both went our separate ways. I finished up and got out of there before the kitchen crew made their way in the next morning. About 4 months later, I ran into that staff member at a Walmart. "You know," she said, "after you went back to the kitchen, I checked the security cameras." My eyes got really wide. "You were right. You walked past that door and the lights came on. After you walked away, they went back off." I was in shock. I knew I wasn't seeing things. "It didn't show anything in the room, but from the view of the hallway, it definitely shows that the lights came on and then went off," she said. "I think we were both already freaked out, so I didn't say anything to you about it that night. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know what I saw. There was an old woman in that chair, and according to the staff member, that old woman was no longer alive."
Story 21. A table for sale, but you'll pay a price. One day, as I was browsing through Craigslist, I stumbled upon a listing for a really cute vintage table that would fit perfectly in my tiny, somewhat retro-looking apartment. The description said it was in great condition, and the price? It was a steal. Not wanting to waste any time, I quickly contacted the seller. "I've had some interest in it," the seller said, "but if you can get here in the next few hours, it's yours." "I'm going to go pick it up," I told my roommate. "Will you come with me so that I don't have to go alone?" My roommate looked at me with disappointment on her face. "I can't. I've got to leave for work in a few minutes," she said. "But it's really unsafe to be going to a stranger's house all alone. You shouldn't do it." I thought about the table and how cute it was. I really wanted it, and the seller told me that there were others interested in it. So, Despite my roommate's warning, I messaged the seller. Yes, I can be there shortly. Placing the address into the GPS, it looked to be in a safe neighborhood. It wasn't a neighborhood that I was overly familiar with, but I believed it to be a safe area nonetheless. I would soon discover just how wrong I was. I remember feeling my stomach sink as I approached the house. It was super sketchy, with its peeling paint, overgrown yard, and a general aura of neglect. My gut was sending warning signals, but then I thought about the table and how it would look in my living room. I'm already here, I told myself. Let's just get it done and get out of here. I exited the car, keeping my head on a swivel as I approached the front door. As I slowly pressed the doorbell, my sixth sense seemed to be screaming at me to turn around. When the door opened, I was hit with another wave of apprehension. The man inside was a mess. He had unkempt hair, stained clothing, and an unsettling grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. His voice was unnervingly friendly as he said, "Oh, you're here for the table, right? It's inside. Come on in." He said this as he looked around behind me, as if to check to see if I were alone. Every alarm bell in my head started ringing. The interior of the house was dimly lit, and what I could see was in disarray. Something was seriously off. I found myself stepping back, stuttering something about having forgotten my wallet at home. The urgency in his voice as he tried to convince me to come inside only heightened my fear. "It's fine, dear," he said. "Come on in. You've got nothing to worry about. You're going to need my help carrying this out to your SUV." There was something so sinister about the entire situation. The look in his eyes, and the way he smiled, it was like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Finally, the alarm bells were too loud. I turned on my heels and sprinted to my car. My heart was slamming against my ribcage. As I fumbled with my keys, his muffled calls followed me, but I didn't dare to glance back until I was safely inside my vehicle, doors locked. He stood at the doorway yelling, like it was a threshold he couldn't cross, like he didn't want to be seen in the open. I hit the ignition and drove away as fast as I could. When I was at a safe distance, I pulled over. My entire body was shaking from the adrenaline. I finally gathered myself and returned to my apartment. There, I took a cold shower, as if trying to cleanse myself of the entire experience. Later that night, my roommate returned, and I recounted the entire ordeal to her. She scolded me, as she had every right to do. "I told you," she said. "Something terrible could have happened to you." A few days later, I was mindlessly watching the news only to be jolted upright by a familiar image. There he was, the creepy guy being arrested for several crimes he'd committed using that abandoned house as a base. The report said he was a squatter and had been luring people there through online marketplaces with various scams and potentially dangerous intents. I felt sick and shaky, thinking of what could have happened if I'd ignored my instincts and stepped inside. I reported my interaction with him to the police, including the messages and the online account he used. That experience was a sobering lesson in trusting my intuition over a seemingly good deal. I didn't get the table, but I was lucky enough to escape a possibly dangerous situation. Now, safety trumps everything else, and no piece of furniture, no matter how perfect, will ever change that again.
Story 22. I saw the Fouke monster feeding. On the list of places that you've never been to, or will never go, Fouke, Arkansas is probably somewhere at the top. It's a tiny town in the southwesternmost part of the state. It's only really known for one thing, the Fouke monster, the subject of an early 1970s film called The Legend of Boggy Creek. The monster supposedly doesn't exist, but I'm here to tell you that it does. I know this because I've seen it with my own eyes. In the early fall of 2016, I was making my way up north from Shreveport, Louisiana to Texarkana. I worked for one of the world's largest delivery companies, so at times I found myself driving late night or early morning hours. On this particular occasion, I was driving a large delivery van just after 2 a.m. in the morning. I was on the interstate, about 5 miles south of Fouke, and there was nobody else in sight. As I rounded a corner, something caught in my headlights in the distance. Just off to the side of the road, a deer was laying there, presumably hit by a vehicle at some point and left for dead. Nothing unusual about that. People see dead deer on the side of the road all the time. But what was unusual is that there was something with it, something large. At first I thought it was a bear. I began to slow my vehicle to get a better look. As I inched closer, I could see that this was no bear. It was something very large. It was kneeling, and it was feeding. A sudden feeling of dread and fear washed over me as I crept closer. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. If it wasn't a bear, the only other thing that it could have been was a man in a ghillie suit. But it couldn't have been that either. It was just way too large. It had hair all over, unnaturally elongated arms and hands, and it was using those arms and hands to carve out the insides of this deer. It was just scooping and eating as quickly as it could. It was primal and terrifying. It had blood all over its hands, mouth, and chest. It was the most horrific and grotesque sight I had ever seen. There was one other thing, too. It was staring directly at me. I was confused, curious, mortified, and terrified all at once. As I inched closer, it never wavered. Its eyes were locked onto me, and it just kept feeding. It's as if it were telling me, if you stop, this will be the last thing you ever see. As I got within about 30 feet or so, I snapped to my senses and smashed the gas pedal. I sped down the road, my heart nearly pounding out of my chest. As I reached Fouke, I felt like I was far enough down the road to be clear of it, so I pulled into a gas station to gather myself. When I stepped into the store, I was still shaken. There was a man behind the register. "You doing all right?" he asked with a curious look. I was sure that he noticed that there was something going on with me. "Yeah, I'm okay," I said. "Just need to grab a cup of coffee to keep myself awake." This was an obvious lie. My senses were on full alert, and I couldn't have been any more awake. "I hear ya," the man said. I grabbed a cup of coffee and took it to the register. Pulled between wanting answers and risking sounding crazy, I finally looked at the man and said, "Hey, this is going to sound weird, but I saw something on the side of the road." "Okay," the man said. I continued. "It was big, and I thought it was a bear, but as I got closer, it didn't look like a bear." The man looked at me and slightly nodded his head up and down as if to say, "Oh, you've seen it." "Do you know what it was?" I asked. The man took a breath and kind of stared off into the distance for a moment, like he was contemplating what to say to me. "Let me just say," he paused for another moment, "things around these parts that are supposed to be legends really aren't, and I'll leave it at that." I looked at him, half confused and half understanding. "If you see anything like that again, next time it's best to just keep driving and pretend that you didn't." I nodded, still in somewhat of a daze. I thanked the man, grabbed my coffee, and left. For about another year, I continued to drive that route, sometimes in the early hours of the morning. Most nights were uneventful, as they should have been. Every now and then, however, I would spot a deer on the side of the road, and my heart would start pounding. The events of that night left an obvious mark on me, and they continue to do so even to this day. The legend of Boggy Creek, it seems, isn't really a legend after all. Story 23. The Girl at the Door. I never thought an overnight shift at a fast food restaurant could turn into the most horrifying night of my life. My manager, Daryl, approached me one day with his usual nonchalant demeanor, asking me to work an overnight cleaning shift in preparation for a visit from some high-level executives the following morning. Despite the short notice and unusual hours, from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., I agreed, recognizing the urgency in his request. The night started typically. As soon as the lobby closed at 10 p.m., I began my work, scouring every inch of the restaurant to ensure it was pristine for the upcoming visit. The drive-through crew worked busily, providing a subtle background noise that broke the eerie silence typical of late-night shifts. After their departure around 1 a.m., the restaurant fell into a silence that, for some reason, heightened my alertness. It wasn't until 1:30 a.m., when an unexpected timid knock at the lobby door jolted my attention. There, through the glass, stood a young girl, no older than 20, her eyes pooling with a mix of desperation and urgency. She gestured toward her phone, and then made a talking motion with her hand, signaling she needed to make a call. My instincts, typically inclined towards assistance, nudged me to help her. The battery on my phone died. "Can I use yours to make a call?" she asked through the glass door. It was strict policy that we were to never unlock the door or let anyone in after hours. This included family and friends, and it definitely included complete strangers. She looked so innocent, though, and my heartstrings pulled to help her out. Yet something felt unsettlingly off about the situation. My hand hovered over the door lock, hesitation now building. But just as I made the decision to go ahead and unlock it, I noticed a subtle movement in the dimly lit periphery of the parking lot. My heart pounded loudly in my ears as I leaned slightly, trying to get a better view of the shadow lurking just around the corner of the building. "Hey," she said. "Are you going to open the door?" Her pleas, though seemingly genuine, concealed an undercurrent of urgency that didn't quite align with her initial mild demeanor. I hesitated more. "Open the door now," she snapped at me. Her face had now completely changed. The distressed damsel she'd presented just moments before was now gone, and what stood on the other side of the window seemed annoyed and frustrated. I shook my head slightly, gesturing that I would use my phone to call someone for her. "I'll call the cops for you," I said. "They can come and help you." She now appeared to be fuming. Nevertheless, I went to retrieve my phone. When I returned, she was gone. Nowhere to be found. I looked all around the periphery of the restaurant. There was no one. The remaining half hour until my shift ended was nothing but fear, paranoia, and second-guessing. When my shift ended, I darted to my car as fast as I could. I never saw the girl again. Looking back now, the whole situation makes my hair stand on end. I was just a hesitation away from unlocking that door. Then what? Who was in the dark corner of the parking lot? What was their intent? Thankfully, I'll be able to ponder over those questions. Had I opened that door, though, it might be a different story. Story 24. Got a light? Back in 2007, I was making a long drive out from northern Utah into Steamboat Springs, Colorado for some business. It was a decent drive, and I got a late start. While en route, my old college buddy Rick gave me a call. We hadn't talked in a while, so it was the perfect time to catch up. We chatted up a bit, and during the call, he mentioned that I'd be driving pretty close to Skinwalker Ranch, a place notorious for paranormal happenings. I shrugged it off, chuckling at his attempt to rattle me up with ghost stories and legends. I didn't believe in such things, and I wasn't the type to get spooked easily. After a good laugh, I let him go and reached down for a cigarette. I had one left and a long drive still ahead, so I decided to restock and refuel. It was dark by the time I pulled into this small gas station. I refueled and walked inside to grab a snack and some cigarettes. Inside, I found myself alone with the clerk, a middle-aged guy with a friendly enough smile. "How's it going?" the guy said. "Good, you?" I said back. With a slight chuckle, the man replied, "Couldn't be better." I grabbed a bag of chips and a drink and walked over to the counter. "Let me grab a pack of Marlboro Lights," I said. "Sure thing," the clerk said as he turned around to grab them. As he was doing so, the conversation I had just had with Rick about Skinwalker Ranch was still on my mind. On a whim, I decided to ask the clerk about it. After all, I assumed he was a local and probably had some stories. "Hey, I'm not from around here. What's up with this Skinwalker Ranch?" I said to him. As the man turned around, his light-hearted demeanor changed instantly. He looked at me sternly, his eyes wide, and he slowly shook his head from side to side. It was an unspoken look that conveyed a clear message. "We don't talk about that here." The mood in the atmosphere changed so quickly. Not knowing what else to do, I stuttered, Well, all right, man, have a good night," as I grabbed my things. The clerk said nothing, but again, his expression conveyed another message loud and clear. "You've been warned." As I headed back to my car, a man emerged from out of nowhere. His appearance was sickly, his clothes ragged and dirty, clinging to a skinny frame. This guy was the definition of creepy. "Hey man, you got a cig?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment, but then obliged. more out of a desire to avoid trouble than any real generosity, to be honest. "Got a light?" he asked. "Yeah, sure," I said back. I looked down as I reached into my pocket, trying not to fumble everything in my hands. Between separating the lighter from my keys and some loose change in my tight pockets, it became more of a task than it should have been. When I finally got a grip on the lighter and looked up, what I saw caught me completely off guard. I saw the end of this creepy man's cigarette already glowing, smoke curling up into the night air. How in the world had he managed that? I looked down for 5 seconds. I didn't hear a flick of a lighter or anything. And why did he ask me for a light if he already had one? Before I could say anything, though, he blurted out, "Where you headed?" Still in a state of confusion, I replied back, East. I got some business." But before I could even finish, he interrupted me. "Ah," he said, "heading east myself. Hey, you mind if I catch a ride with you?" Every alarm bell in my head was ringing. There was something completely off about this man, something that made my skin crawl. I stuttered through an excuse, and his smile widened, but not in a friendly way. It was as if he knew something I didn't, and he was taking joy in that fact. I said. "Well, you see, And once more, before I could finish, he interrupted me. "Ah, no worries, man. Totally get it. Well, you have a safe drive," he said, tipping me a wink that didn't feel comforting at all. With that, he turned around and just walked into the darkness in the distance. I jumped into my car and got the hell out of there, eager to put some distance between us. Thinking the creepiness was behind me, I lit a cigarette as I drove down the road. I was wrong. Dead wrong. The creepiness was just getting started. I was probably half a mile out when I noticed movement in the edge of my headlights, off to the right, on the shoulder of the road. It was hard to make out at first, but as I got closer it became unmistakable. It was the figure of a man running. Not just running. He was flying. I looked down at my speedometer. I was driving 45 miles per hour. This man had to be running 35. My brain didn't know where to go. Was I hallucinating? As I got closer, the figure turned his head back while continuing to run. My heart stopped. It was him, the creepy man from the gas station. His eyes were 2 glowing orbs, like they had eye shine from my headlights. I'll never forget it. As I approached closer, he smiled. It was a sinister, contorted smile. It looked like it stretched from ear to ear. I was absolutely terrified, and I slammed my foot on the accelerator. Despite my car's speed, he kept pace. I was in full-blown panic, my hands shaking. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I didn't believe that I was going to be able to get away from this man, or whatever it was. Then, out of nowhere, headlights appeared in the distance from an oncoming vehicle. As soon as the headlights got closer, the man abruptly stopped and faced my car. As I flew by, I remember us locking eyes. He still had that contorted smile on his face. For a second, everything was in slow motion. He looked at me and I looked at him, and the glow in his eyes conveyed another message. See you next time. But there would be no next time. I would never travel anywhere near Skinwalker Ranch again. Years have gone by now. I've told a few people this story. Most times I get blank looks, like they believe I'm making it up, like it didn't happen. But it did happen. And I'll tell you one thing. Whatever it is that's going on around that place, I don't want anything to do with it. Story 25. Come get it. One day, I ran across a Craigslist ad that seemed like a golden opportunity for someone like me, a DIY enthusiast always on the hunt for some free materials to use in my weekend projects. Free building materials. First come, first serve, it read. Simple, straightforward, and exactly what I needed for my upcoming deck repair. I messaged the seller, and they replied back quickly with 3 words, "Come get it," and the address. I quickly gathered some tools, hopped into my truck, and set the GPS for the destination. As I approached the address, I instantly started getting a bad feeling. The place was visibly run down. Buildings looked beat up, windows smashed in, and the whole area just gave off a creepy vibe. But there in front of me was the warehouse, looking just as worn as everything else. A tiny voice in my head said this might not be a good idea, but free stuff has a certain allure, you know? I pulled up and stepped inside. It was dimly lit, but the old building supplies were there, just as advertised. I remember the light barely squeezing through the dirty windows, but it was a decent enough haul if you weren't too picky. I yelled out, "Yo, anybody here?" Nothing. "Hello?" I yelled out a little louder. Again, nothing. I'm the type of person who usually goes ahead and does something and begs for forgiveness later, rather than waiting for a definite yes or no before I take action. So with that in mind, I went ahead and just started gathering up planks. While I was working away, I heard a weird noise after a bit, like a faint shuffling sound. Quite frankly, it gave me the chills, but I chalked it up to being in an old, creaky building and kept going, trying to ignore the uneasy voice in my head that something was definitely off. Then, clear as day, I heard a voice. My blood ran cold when footsteps started coming my way from the deeper, darker part of the warehouse. I turned around, and this guy, looking rough and unhinged, stepped into the little light there was. This damn man was holding a machete, I kid you not. I didn't know if this was some type of sick prank or if some guy was just out of his mind and had nothing better to do than try to lure a stranger in to have some fun with. Either way, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I dropped everything and bolted towards the door, and I swear I felt him right behind me. When I got to the truck, I locked myself in and saw him just standing in the doorway of the warehouse, watching me. Still, with a machete in his hand. I drove out of there like a bat out of hell, heart racing, and went straight to the police. Turned out, the guy was known to them, had a rap sheet, and was holed up in those buildings. He was a violent guy, they said, been known to do bad things to people. He hadn't murdered anybody yet that they had known about. Who knows, though? If I had stuck around, hell, I might have been the first. Learned my lesson that day. No amount of free stuff is worth ignoring that tiny voice in your head telling you to get the hell out of a situation. Trust your gut. It might just save your hide one day. Story 26. My terrifying experience with the ghost truck of Clinton Road. The summer of 2002, right after our high school graduation, my friends and I had a list of adventures we wanted to tackle. One particular dare was to drive down the infamous Clinton Road in New Jersey, rumored to be the most haunted road in America. There were 3 of us, and we set off a little after midnight. The first few miles were uneventful. The road was infamous for its sharp turns, and as my friend Jake navigated a particularly curvy stretch, we noticed it. A set of bright headlights in our rearview mirror, approaching fast. I remember Jake, who was driving, saying something along the lines of, "There it is," and then us laughing. But within seconds, a truck was tailgating us. Its headlights were so bright, they filled our car, making it hard for us to see. "That guy is in a hurry," I said, not even registering that it could actually be what we came to this road to see. I mean, we didn't actually think that we'd see something. Finally, my other friend Ryan joked, "Maybe it's that ghost truck." At this point, though, nervousness was starting to settle in. As Jake pressed on the accelerator, so did the truck. It stayed right on our tail. Silence now filled our car. The jovial mood from earlier was gone. Suddenly, the truck revved and swung to our left, attempting to overtake us. But instead of speeding past, it drove parallel to us. The truck, the windows, and everything else was pitch black, no silhouette of a driver, nothing. I was really getting nervous now. "Turn off somewhere," I said to Jake. But there was nowhere to go. The road was bordered by dense forests on both sides. Our best hope was to reach the end of Clinton Road. Then the truck did something unexpected. It sped up, going ahead of us quite a ways, and then stopped sideways, blocking our path. Jake skidded to a halt. At this point, we're all in a mess of a panic. The truck turned, and we were once again sitting in the blinding lights of its headlights. "We gotta get out of here," I said to Jake in a panic. Without warning, the truck's headlights went off. It was gone, disappeared. Jake made a U-turn. We couldn't see the truck anymore, but we didn't want to wait around. Jake drove like a man possessed. The curves and turns we had navigated earlier seemed even more dangerous now. "What was that?" "Where'd it go?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling now. We didn't have answers. We only knew we had to get as far away from Clinton Road as possible. Jake was driving with a sense of urgency now. "Hey man," I said, "be careful, this road has sharp..." and before I could complete my thought, we were blinded again. The headlights were back. This time they didn't drive up. They just appeared, like out of nowhere. They were right on our tail, and they were swerving back and forth, back and forth. At this point, we were absolutely terrified. We were yelling and screaming. Just as I thought that we were about to be overrun, the end of the road came into view, and the headlights vanished into thin air. We reached the end of the road, and Jake cut the car over onto the next road. After what felt like an eternity, we saw the familiar sight of the town's lights in the distance, and relief flooded us. Pulling over, Jake put the car in park, and we all sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. Ryan, usually so buoyant, looked pale, his usual humor gone. Finally, Jake spoke up. "That wasn't a normal truck, you guys. That road is haunted, and we just witnessed it." I nodded, my skepticism washed away. "You're right," I said, "but we're safe now, and that's what matters." Word about our night on Clinton Road spread fast. Some believed us, others laughed it off, but we knew what we experienced, and none of us have ever ventured near that road again. Story 27. My terrifying weekend at Hotel Savoy. There are moments in life when your curiosity gets the best of you, and you decide to face the unknown head-on. Last Halloween, I made that very decision. I booked a stay at the Hotel Savoy, renowned as America's oldest continuously operating hotel west of the Mississippi River, with a history dating back to 1888, and having hosted luminaries such as Harry S. Truman and John D. Rockefeller. I was intrigued. But what truly piqued my interest were the rumors of Room 505. The crisp air of late October nipped at my cheeks as I approached the hotel. Its towering facade, reminiscent of an era long gone, was covered in an array of autumnal hues. Checking in was a breeze, the staff was courteous, and the lobby resonated with the laughter of guests, presumably in town to celebrate Halloween. "Room 505, sir." The receptionist handed me the key, her face momentarily clouded with what I perceived to be a mix of concern and curiosity. Maybe she was wondering why someone would willingly stay in that room. The thrill of the weekend ahead made me ignore her fleeting expression. The antiquated elevator groaned and creaked, setting the tone for my stay. When I finally reached my room, the door opened with a faint but distinct screech, revealing an interior that seemed untouched by time. The furnishings were grand, echoing the late 19th century. But it was what lay in the ensuite bathroom that seized my attention. A bathtub, replete with classic taps and fittings. Exhausted, I decided to turn in early. The bed was comfortable, but my dreams that night? Far from it. I dreamt of a young woman dressed in period attire filling up the bathtub. She seemed sad, her expression haunting. I tried calling out to her, but the words never left my lips. In that hazy realm of sleep, I could feel her sorrow, thick and tangible. I woke with a jolt, my heart racing. What I attributed to remnants of the dream soon became my waking nightmare. The taps in the bathroom were on, and the tub was half full. Confused, and now genuinely concerned, I shut the water off, attributing it to some kind of plumbing issue. Trying to shake off the eeriness of the morning, I decided to spend the day exploring the city. But as the sun set, an inexplicable urge drew me back to the hotel. Perhaps it was morbid curiosity, or maybe something more profound. Dinner at the hotel's vintage restaurant was pleasant. Patrons exchanged tales of Halloween pranks and plans. But as dessert arrived, a soft melody wafted through the air. It sounded like someone was playing the piano, but the notes were melancholic, almost heart-wrenching. Asking the staff about it, they merely exchanged glances but said nothing. Retiring to my room, the weight of the history of the place seemed even more profound. I could almost feel the countless stories embedded in its walls, yet I was determined to have a peaceful night. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake once again by the sound of running water. Dreading what I might find, I ventured into the bathroom. The taps were on full blast, and the tub was overflowing. I quickly turned them off, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was no logical explanation. I was alone in the room, and the door was locked from the inside. But what truly sent me into a panic was the wet trail of footprints leading from the tub to the bed. In the dim light of the room, I could clearly see the silhouette of a woman. her dress dripping with water, sitting at the foot of the bed. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and I could hear that melancholic melody again, only this time it was clearer, as if played right next to me. I wanted to run, to scream, but fear rooted me to the spot. After what seemed like an eternity, the figure slowly faded away, leaving me in a room filled with an overwhelming sadness. I spent the rest of the night in the hotel lobby, too scared to return to room 505. At dawn, I approached the reception, eager to check out. I recounted my experience, and the receptionist, an older gentleman this time, nodded slowly. "You encountered Betsy Ward," he began. "She was a young woman who stayed in room 505 in the late 1800s. It is said she died in that very bathtub, heartbroken. Many have reported the taps turning on and off, and some even claim to have seen her. I left the Hotel Savoy with a tale that would haunt me forever. My weekend getaway turned into a confrontation with the supernatural. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, some places carry with them memories so profound that they refuse to be forgotten. Visiting the Hotel Savoy was meant to be a daring adventure, a brush with the unknown. But what I didn't anticipate was how deeply the past can reach out, reminding us of the stories that once unfolded within historical walls. Room 505 is a testament to that. Would I ever return? Maybe, but not alone, and definitely not on Halloween. Story 28. The Uninvited Guest. I had been driving for hours, eager to get away from the city noise and spend a weekend alone in a remote cabin. The stresses of my day-to-day job had been taking a toll on me, and I needed a break. I had found a cabin on Airbnb that seemed perfect, secluded, surrounded by woods, and with an amazing view of a serene lake. The reviews were all positive, with guests praising the quiet beauty of the place. When I arrived, the sun was setting. The cabin was amazing, made of dark timber with large windows that allowed a beautiful view of the surroundings. After unloading my stuff and making a quick dinner, I settled in the living area with a book. The darkness outside enveloped the cabin quickly, but as the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to brush it off, attributing it to the unfamiliarity of the woods and the innate fear of the unknown that many of us have. After all, I was alone in a remote area. When I decided to turn in for the night, I made sure all the windows and doors were locked. My room had a large window facing the dense woods. Lying in bed, the eeriness of the silence felt profound. The earlier peace I felt was replaced by an unsettling quiet. Somewhere around 1 a.m., a creak in the floorboard of the front porch jolted me awake. At first I thought it was just an animal or something, but as I listened closely, it sounded more like footsteps. Trying not to panic, I sat up, straining my ears to pinpoint the source. The sound grew louder, and I could now clearly hear footsteps approaching the front door. Every so often they would stop, and a heavy silence would take over, only to be interrupted again by the steps. I dared not move, afraid to make any noise. The only source of light was the dim moonlight filtering through the windows. Suddenly, a shadow peeked around the corner of the window in the door. I was paralyzed by fear. The silhouette seemed to be of a tall man, but the features were indistinguishable. He pressed his face against the window, and I could see his breath fogging it up. His eyes were wide open, devoid of any emotion, staring directly at me. Our eyes locked, and though he made no move to enter or break down the door, the mere intensity of his gaze made my blood run cold. It felt like an eternity, but eventually he pulled away from the window and the sound of his footsteps slowly faded into the distance. I stayed frozen in my bed, too terrified to move. When dawn finally broke, the terror of the night gave way to the beautiful serenity of the morning. Gathering my courage, I decided to inspect the perimeter of the cabin. My heart sank when I saw the multiple sets of footprints, confirming what I already knew. Rushing inside, I immediately called the local police. They arrived within the hour, and I relayed the entire ordeal to them. They conducted a thorough search of the surrounding woods but didn't find anybody. However, they did find a campsite on the other side of the hill, not far from the cabin, which seemed to have been recent, but abandoned now. Not feeling completely safe anymore, I cut my trip short. I informed my Airbnb host of the incident. and they promised to look into the matter. I often wonder what would have happened if that creepy man had decided to do more than just watch that night. I've honestly never been so scared before in my life. It's a very unsettling feeling of knowing that you're being watched, and not knowing the intent of the person watching you. It's been a while since I've rented another Airbnb. I haven't sworn them off altogether, but I do believe my next rental won't be so isolated and remote. Story 29. I'm no longer alone in the facility. Working at the storage facility was always peaceful, but mundane, a regular 9 to 5 with occasional customer interactions, paperwork, and keeping an eye on the camera. But everything changed after we were struck by a streak of break-ins. My boss asked if I would be okay holding down the fort during the lonely, dark graveyard shift, a precaution to deter the thieves, I suppose. She and another worker would take the day shifts, and I would take the nights. Just for a week, she said. Pay and a half was a good incentivization, so I took it. The shifts went by without a hitch. I mostly watched the monitors, chugged coffee, and played on my phone. Before my last shift on the last night, I was sent to Home Depot with the company card, and asked to fetch new bolt cutters since ours were done. They were old, rusted, and dull. It was then that I met a creepy man. He was there in the aisle, doing the same, looking for bolt cutters. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him looking at me. He was just staring at me, and it was uncomfortably creepy. Finally, he asked about the storage facility that I worked at. As I looked over, he was pointing at the company shirt that I was wearing. "Yeah," I said. "Just picking up some bolt cutters. The ones we have are old." He nodded his head and continued with questions. "What time do I usually work? How many people work there? What hours are we typically open?" They were weird questions, and uncomfortable to say the least. Not wanting to answer any more questions, I finally picked out a pair of cutters. "Well, have a good one," I said. "You too," the creepy man said. As I turned to walk down the aisle, I felt like his eyes were on me the entire time. I paid and left, brushing off the exchange as just a weird encounter with a creepy man. Returning to the storage facility, I settled in for a long night. As the night progressed a few hours, a thunderstorm rolled in. The winds were picking up, and the rain was coming in heavily. As I was sitting behind the desk, looking out at the rain, I noticed movement on one of the cameras. There was a tall, skinny person that had just hopped the fence onto the grounds of the facility. The person looked to be a man. He was hooded and dressed in dark clothing. It looked like he was carrying something too. I inched closer to the monitor, trying to get a better look. As I strained to look, it dawned on me what he was carrying. Bolt cutters. The man looked around, and then started making his way to one of the units. I started to reach for my phone, but couldn't take my eyes off of the monitor. He was swinging the bolt cutters around to his other hand, when out of nowhere, he looked up and directly into the camera. My heart, by now pounding uncontrollably, dropped into my stomach. He was wearing a mask. It covered his nose and his mouth, obscuring his identity. But his eyes were visible, and it was as if they were staring directly into mine through the monitor. By this time, I should have already been on the phone with the police, but I was absolutely frozen. Then, his head slowly looked down as if he was looking at something in the distance. As I watched, my heart dropped even further when I realized that he was looking in the direction of the office. The very office that I was sitting in, watching all of this unfold. Slowly he dropped the bolt cutters to the ground, never taking his eyes off of the office. I was shaking, and it was almost like I was in a trance. There was a voice in my head yelling, "Call 911! Call 911!" But I couldn't hear it because I was locked onto the monitor. The man slowly set the cutters down, and then began to walk slowly over towards my office. As he did so, he placed one of his hands inside a pocket. Just as he walked out of frame, he began pulling his hand back out. I was able to pick him up on another camera though, but this time I was viewing his backside as he was slowly approaching the office, which was in frame too. As he pulled his hand out, I could barely make out something that almost made me pass out. It looked like he was pulling out a knife. Just then, there was a huge crack of thunder, and then, As if things couldn't get any worse for me, the electricity went out. It was pitch black now, and there was a guy walking towards the office I was in with what I believed to be a knife. If any good came out of the electricity going out, though, when the monitor shut off, it was as if I was jolted out of my trance. I threw myself under the desk and finally called 911. "There's someone here and I think they have a knife," I said to the operator in a panic. "I need the police here now." As I was speaking with the operator, the unthinkable happened. I began to hear jiggling from the door handle at the back of the office, the one located on the facility side of the entrance gate. I began shaking uncontrollably. "I need someone here now," I said in a panic. The operator tried to comfort me. "We've got officers on the way." Because I was under the desk, I couldn't see anything except the wall behind it, and the floor beneath me. But I could hear everything, and the man's determination to get into the office was escalating. Then, out of nowhere, the jiggling stopped. Any relief that I would have had was short-lived, though. After a brief pause, there was a huge bang. I wish it was thunder, but unfortunately it wasn't. The man was now trying to kick in the door. My eyes watered up with tears. "Please," I begged the operator. Another bang, this time more violent. At that moment, I felt like the next kick would burst open the door. I closed my eyes and braced myself for the final blow, the one that was going to leave nothing between the intruder and me. The tears were now pouring from my eyes, and I could barely control my breathing. I waited, for what felt like an eternity, for the final blow to come, and for the door to burst open. 5 seconds went by, then 10, then 15, but the final blow never came. After what felt like at least a minute, I slowly opened my eyes. They revealed red and blue lights flickering off the wall behind the desk. The cops had arrived. I crawled out from under the desk. There were 2 cop cars. The one in front was pointing its spotlight towards me in the office. I rushed out of the office towards them. 2 more cars arrived. I detailed what happened. Because the electricity was still out, I couldn't raise the gate. So all of the cops took off on foot except for one who stayed back with me. After a thorough search, they found nothing. No intruder, no bolt cutters, nothing. The man had made his way out, leaving nothing but a few dents in the back door of the office. An investigation took place, but in my opinion, it seemed to be low priority. Nothing was ever stolen, the intruder never made entry into the office, and nobody was hurt. I even told them about the creepy man at Home Depot. I'm not sure they ever followed up on him. They did some extra patrols for a few nights, but after about a week or so, those stopped, and it was like nothing ever happened. Questions still haunt me. Who was this person, and why were they trying to get into the office? Why didn't they just try to steal something from a unit and then leave? Who was the creepy man at Home Depot, and did he have anything to do with this? Amongst these questions, there is one thing I do know for certain. I will never work another graveyard shift ever again. Story 30. The Old Barn. I've always been a runner. There's something about the rhythm of my feet hitting the trail, the steady breaths, and the beat of my heart in my ears that brings a sense of peace. Time stands still, and the world around me blurs. I've been running the same trail for months, ever since I moved to this part of town. It's a picturesque run, with woods that change with the seasons, fields that stretch wide, and in the distance, and on one part of the trail, an old abandoned barn. It's become a fixture of my runs, a landmark I look forward to. One autumn afternoon, I set off on my usual route. The air was crisp, and the sky seemed clear. I should have known better. I should have paid more attention to the weather report. Halfway through my run, just as I was approaching the part of the trail where the barn could be seen, the sky opened up. Rain poured in sheets, and thunder began to hammer. Cursing my luck and my lack of observation, I realized I was miles from home with no real shelter in sight except the barn. It wasn't ideal, but it beat getting drenched and risking a cold or worse. Squinting through the downpour, I made my way across the field toward the silhouette of the barn. Inside, it was as you'd expect, dilapidated, run down, and beat up. You could tell that it had done everything that it could to fend off the elements for many years, but could barely fend off any more of Mother Nature's abuse. Rain drummed on the roof, occasionally sneaking through holes and cracks, creating thin waterfalls. Regardless, it was marginally better than the alternative. As I waited, hoping the storm would pass quickly, I glanced around, and my eyes were drawn to the loft area above. Curiosity poked at me, and I decided to take a look, if only to pass the time. What I found wasn't the emptiness I expected. There were belongings scattered around: a ratty blanket, plastic bags, bits of food wrappers, and a water bottle. It wasn't old debris. Someone was staying here. As I looked around, something caught my eye through one of the grimy windows. It was a figure moving through the field in the storm towards the barn. It was difficult to make out details, but the movement was purposeful, direct. My heart picked up pace a little bit as I realized that I was about to have an encounter with someone. I descended the ladder and turned around just in time to see a man burst through the barn's weak door. His appearance was messy, clothes in tatters, a wild beard, but it was his eyes that caught me. They were wide, almost bulging. The whites of his eyes were such a glaring contrast against the dirt of his skin. I raised my hands, trying to project out a friendly greeting. I stammered out that I was just seeking shelter from the storm, but my words seemed to ricochet off him. His look was one of surprise at first, but quickly turned to anger. Out of nowhere he began to scream. It was so loud, violent, and piercing that I thought it would bring down the entire barn. I was taken off guard. I didn't know what to expect from the encounter, but I sure as hell didn't expect this. He jumped up and down and swung his arms erratically as he screamed, "Get out! Get out!" I didn't need to be told twice. I hurried my way out. My eyes were glued to him as I dodged around him. Forgetting the rain and the risk of illness, I bolted. I chose the storm's violence over his, and I ran, slipping and sliding in the mud until the barn was far behind me. The experience stuck with me for a while. It was intense, unlike anything I had ever experienced. I thought about calling the cops, but something held me back. That barn, at the end of the day, was his home. It wasn't much, but it was his. Who was I to take that away? Aside from that, I was technically trespassing, even if I was just trying to seek shelter. Weighing those two factors, I decided to just let it be. I continue my runs, as steadfast in that routine as ever. But now, when I pass the spot where the barn rises in the distance, I'll be honest. My pace involuntarily picks up, and I can't help but have a little bit more heightened awareness about my surroundings. As for the man, I have no ill will towards him. If he's still there in that barn, I hope he's doing well. If he's not, if he's moved on, I hope he's doing well wherever he may be.
Story 31. Mia and the Witch Lady. Ties that transcend time. The fall breeze was crisp, and a medley of orange and red leaves had begun to blanket my backyard. Every October, I'd get into the spirit of Halloween by decorating my house with spooky ornaments and setting up a haunted maze for the neighborhood kids. But this particular Halloween was different, for it was the first time we'd spend it in our newly bought ancestral home. The move into the old family home had been a decision born out of nostalgia. It was where my mother had grown up, and she had always regaled us with tales of her childhood spent running up and down the creaky stairs, chasing after her siblings. But while my two older children, Ben and Sophie, adjusted well to the new setting, my youngest, Mia, had an aversion to the upstairs section of the house. During our first week, Mia refused to go upstairs alone. If she had to use the bathroom, she'd resist for hours or pester her siblings until one of them accompanied her. I initially dismissed it as the usual hesitations children often feel in unfamiliar surroundings. But as days turned into weeks, her apprehension became a concerning pattern. One sunny afternoon, I sat Mia down in the living room, the golden rays of the setting sun streaming through the vintage curtains. "Sweetie," I began gently, "can you tell me why you're so scared of going upstairs?" She hesitated, her blue eyes darting away. "The old witch lady," she finally whispered, her voice quivering. My eyebrows knitted in confusion. "What old witch lady?" "The one near our bedroom closet," she elaborated, her voice barely above a whisper. "She has wild hair all over the place, And her hands, they look like claws. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to keep my composure. Honey, there's no one in the house but us. But Mommy, Mia's eyes filled with tears. She's there, all hunched over and tiny, and she stares at me. This was troubling. Our home was old, but there were no signs of any squatters or stray animals. Moreover, Mia's description didn't match anyone we knew. To ease her fears, I decided to indulge Mia's imagination. Maybe if I could show her there was nothing in the closet, she'd get over her fear. That evening, armed with a flashlight, I took her hand and we walked upstairs. Together, we checked every nook and cranny of her room, especially the closet. As expected, there was no witch lady. A few days passed, and the incident with the witch lady was starting to fade. My family was invited to my parents' house for dinner. Over homemade pies and roasted turkey, we caught up, laughing at shared memories. The topic of our ancestral home came up, and I mentioned Mia's odd fear of the upstairs and her description of the witch lady. I tried to keep the tone light, but there was an unmistakable shift in the room's energy. My mother, usually the life of the party, went unusually quiet. She rose from her seat and walked over to an old wooden cabinet that housed family albums. She pulled out an aged black and white photograph and handed it to me. The photo depicted a frail, elderly woman. Her hair was unkempt, almost wild-looking, but it was her hands that caught my attention. They were twisted and deformed, with large knots at the knuckles, making them resemble claws. Her posture was hunched, and she sat in an old wheelchair. Mia, I beckoned, my voice shaky. Is this the lady you saw? My daughter's face drained of color as she nodded, her eyes wide with terror. That's my grandmother, my mom spoke up, her voice heavy with emotion. Your great-grandmother. I looked at my mother, my mind racing to make sense of it all. But Mom, Mia never met her. My mother took a deep breath. She had severe rheumatoid arthritis. The condition deformed her hands and made her hunch over. Because of her condition, she was confined to that wheelchair for the latter part of her life. I remembered faint tales of my great-grandmother, how she was bedridden during her last days and had passed away in the very house we now lived in. But I had never seen her pictures, let alone shown them to Mia. The crazy hair, my mom continued, tears forming in her eyes, was because she had to rely on someone else to comb it. Sometimes it remained unkempt. The room was enveloped in a somber mood. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and the realization was both astounding and terrifying. Somehow, Mia had seen my great-grandmother, someone she had no knowledge of. That night, as we returned home, the earlier festive spirit of Halloween was overshadowed by the chilling revelations of the evening. While I still couldn't fathom how Mia had witnessed an apparition of our ancestor, I felt an odd connection to our family's past. It was as if, through Mia, my great-grandmother was reaching out, reminding us of the ties that bind us through time and generations. While Halloween approached with its ghosts and ghouls, we had encountered a specter far more intimate and inexplicable. The festive decorations now seemed trivial compared to the eerie connection my daughter had experienced. Mia never mentioned the witch lady again. Perhaps the acknowledgement of her presence and understanding her identity was all that was needed. The ancestral home, with its creaky stairs and old memories, held more mysteries than we had ever imagined. And as Halloween night descended upon us, we couldn't shake off the eerie feeling of being closely watched by the ghosts of our own past.
Story 32. Apartment 407. Moving to the heart of the city had always been a dream for Clara and me. After months of searching, we finally settled on a nice apartment complex in the downtown area. The apartment had nice amenities like a rooftop garden, a state-of-the-art gym, and a spacious pool area. Our apartment, on the 4th floor, was a sprawling 2-bedroom space with floor-to-ceiling windows and a nice view of the pool below. The floor, we were told, only had a handful of tenants. That didn't bother us much. One of those tenants, however, seemed to be a mystery to us. Apartment 407, right next to us, appeared to house someone. We'd often hear footsteps in the corridor, and the sound of the door opening and closing. But by the time we'd peek through our peephole, there would be no one there. One evening, while Clara was trying out a new recipe in our kitchen, an eerie moaning echoed from 407. It sounded like a blend of pain and sorrow, a sound that really gave us the chills. Concerned for our unseen neighbor, I decided to check on him. Stepping out, I knocked on the door. As soon as my knuckles made contact, the moaning stopped. I waited, feeling the weight of the silence, but no answer came. "Hello?" I said. "Is everything okay?" There was no response. Days passed, and the events of that evening weighed on my mind. Clara and I would at times press our ears up against the wall, and would hear footsteps and mumbling coming from the next apartment over. Trying to shake everything off, we focused on settling into our new life. We frequented the gym, dined at the nearby gourmet restaurants, and spent lazy afternoons by the complex's nice pool. One evening, as we lounged by that pool, Clara suddenly tapped me on my leg. "Look," she whispered, discreetly motioning with her head upwards. Following her gaze, I saw a shadowy figure standing behind the sheer curtain of apartment 407. But in the blink of an eye, it disappeared. The sight was so fleeting that I would have dismissed it as a trick of the light had Clara not seen it too. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to speak with the apartment manager, Mrs. Patterson. She was a sweet woman in her 50s, with silver streaks in her hair and a perpetual warm smile. Upon inquiring about the tenant of 407, her expression turned from one of casual interest to confusion. "No one's been living in 407 for several weeks," she said, her voice laced with genuine surprise. I relayed our strange experiences to her, the sounds, the silhouette, the eerie moaning. Mrs. Patterson, now visibly concerned, decided to accompany me to the apartment. As we approached the wooden door of 407, those all too familiar murmurs met our ears. Mrs. Patterson hesitated, then knocked. Instantly the sounds ceased. She knocked again. Nothing. No sounds and no answer. With a heightened look of confusion on her face, she unlocked the door. The apartment was a stark contrast to ours. While our unit was filled with life, love, and warmth, 407 was cold and desolate. There was nothing there. No furniture, no belongings, and no person. Just a single sheer curtain covering the living room window. There was no sign of recent occupancy at all. Mrs. Patterson, her face pale, relayed the tragic history of the apartment. Mr. Applegate, a solitary elderly man, had been its tenant for years. Known for his reclusive habits, he rarely ventured out. Tragically, he had suffered a fatal fall in the apartment. It appeared that he had tripped, his head taking a blow on the counter before coming to rest on the floor. His agonized moans eventually alerted a neighbor down the hall, but help arrived too late, and Mr. Applegate passed away right there, before the ambulance could arrive. These events, she said, happened about 3 weeks before we moved in. The weight of what Mrs. Patterson was telling me was immense. How could this be? The sounds, the footsteps, the moans. Someone had to be in that apartment, but there was no one. As I later relayed the revelation to Clara, I could see the blood run out of her face. "That's impossible," she said. "We're always hearing noises from that apartment." "I know," I said back to her, "but the manager told me that there's been no one in that apartment for weeks, not since Mr. Applegate died." Deciding that this was a little bit too much for us to handle, we requested to be moved to a different room and floor. Mrs. Patterson, out of the kindness of her heart, accepted and moved us to the 6th floor. Life has resumed its rhythm in our new space. No noises, no footsteps, no murmurs or moans. Sometimes, though, while enjoying the sunset by the pool, Clara and I find our eyes drifting up to that window. Every so often, I swear, you can still catch a glimpse of someone walking around. In apartment 407,